Tonight, we begin with the remarkable persistence of medieval mysteries, stories once dismissed as legend, conspiracy, or the exaggerated tales of wine-soaked chroniclers, now unraveling under the patient, methodical gaze of modern science. If you enjoy drifting through these ancient tales where fact slowly emerges from fiction, consider joining us for more journeys into the twilight spaces between history and mystery. Now, let the outside world fade away, dim the lights around you, perhaps let the gentle hum of evening settle into your thoughts, and prepare to drift alongside us through corridors of time, where secrets have waited centuries to be understood. Picture, if you will, Lincoln Cathedral, in the heart of medieval England. That magnificent Gothic monument where stonemasons and architects once competed to touch the very heavens with their flying buttresses and soaring spires. The cathedral stands as a testament to human ambition, to faith carved in limestone and devotion measured in decades of patient construction. Yet beneath this architectural marvel, in the quiet darkness of the crypt, lay a mystery that would perplex generations of scholars and historians. In the 1960s, when archaeologists carefully excavated beneath the cathedral's ancient foundations, their methodical work revealed something unexpected. There, nestled in the earth that had held its secrets for centuries, lay the skeleton of a man. The initial assumption seemed logical enough, reasonable by the standards of medieval burial practices. Surely this was a monk, some devoted brother who had lived and died in service to this sacred place, his bones finding eternal rest beneath the stones where he had once knelt in prayer. But this skeleton refused to conform to expectations, where one might expect to find the simple robes of a religious brother, the careful positioning of arms crossed in holy resignation, or perhaps the humble artifacts that would accompany a man of God to his final rest. There were none. Instead, the remains spoke of something different, something that did not fit the neat categories that historians prefer. The body lay face down, buried with what seemed like haste rather than ceremony, positioned not with the reverent care typically afforded to the clergy, but with the practical urgency of concealment. For decades, this anomaly puzzled those who studied the cathedral's history. Theories emerged and faded like morning mist. Perhaps he was a heretic, buried in shame. Perhaps some scandal had marked his final days, some transgression that required his interment to be conducted in darkness and secrecy. The medieval world, after all, was one where spiritual purity and social standing were inextricably linked, where the manner of one's burial could speak volumes about the life that preceded it. Then came the revolution of isotope analysis, a technique that allows scientists to read the very bones themselves as if they were pages in an ancient book. The skeleton's bones, subjected to this modern form of divination, began to tell their story. The chemical signatures locked within the calcium and minerals revealed not the tale of a local English monk, but something far more poignant and profound. This man had been born under different skies, in the fjord-carved landscapes of Scandinavia, where the aurora dances across winter nights, and the sea speaks in ancient tongues. His bones carried the isotopic signature of northern European soil, of water drunk from different rivers, of food grown in distant fields. The wear patterns on his joints told of countless miles walked, of a journey that had stretched across vast distances and through foreign lands. He was, the scientists realized, a pilgrim, one of those countless thousands who throughout the medieval period left behind everything familiar to walk the sacred paths of Christendom. Perhaps he had begun his journey in the pine forests of Sweden, or along the rocky coasts of Norway, carrying nothing but faith and determination. His destination might have been Canterbury, where the bones of St. Thomas Becket promised healing and spiritual redemption, or perhaps one of the many other sacred sites that dotted the medieval landscape like stars in a constellation of faith. The journey from Scandinavia to Lincoln would have been arduous beyond modern comprehension. Medieval roads were treacherous paths that wound through forests filled with bandits, across rivers that could turn deadly with spring floods, through lands where languages changed as frequently as the weather. A pilgrim traveled not with the security of modern transportation or communication, but with only the hope that each village, each monastery, each town would offer shelter to a stranger whose only currency was devotion. Consider the boots he must have worn, leather crafted by hands that understood the demands of long journeys, yet still insufficient against the endless miles of stone and mud. Think of the nights spent in haylofts and monastery guest houses, the simple meals of bread and porridge that sustained him, the prayers whispered in the darkness when exhaustion and doubt threatened to overwhelm his purpose. His was a faith measured not in comfortable Sunday services, but in blistered feet and aching bones, in the daily choice to continue when every rational thought urged him to turn back. When he finally reached Lincoln, this anonymous pilgrim from the north was likely already weakened by his journey. Medieval medicine understood little about the toll such travels took on the human body, the way constant walking could wear down joints, the manner in which poor nutrition and exposure could gradually sap a person's strength. He may have collapsed near the cathedral, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated strain of his pilgrimage, his heart perhaps giving out within sight of the sacred stones he had travelled so far to see. The clergy of Lincoln faced a delicate situation. Here was a foreign pilgrim, a man whose devotion had brought him hundreds of miles from home, yet who had died before he could complete his spiritual journey. He deserved burial in consecrated ground, recognition of his faith and sacrifice, yet he was also a stranger whose death posed practical questions. Without family or local connections, without the social networks that typically surrounded death in medieval communities, his passing created a kind of spiritual and administrative puzzle. The solution they chose speaks to both pragmatism and compassion. They buried him beneath the cathedral, in holy ground, but without the elaborate ceremony that would typically mark such an interment. His grave was simple, unmarked, the kind of resting place that would not draw attention or require explanation to curious parishioners. It was neither the honored burial of a local holy man, nor the shameful concealment of a sinner, but something more nuanced, a quiet acknowledgement of a life lived in faith, but ended in anonymity. For centuries, this Scandinavian pilgrim rested unknown beneath the stones of Lincoln Cathedral, his story lost to time, his identity reduced to whispered speculation about heretics and scandals. The medieval world that buried him gradually faded into history. The Black Death came and went. The Reformation transformed the very nature of the church above his grave. Wars and politics reshaped the landscape he had walked to reach this place. Yet still his bones waited in the darkness, holding their secrets. The revelation of his true identity transforms our understanding, not just of this one man, but of the vast networks of faith that connected medieval Europe. He represents thousands of similar pilgrims, men and women who left comfortable lives to walk dangerous paths in search of spiritual fulfillment. His bones speak of a world where faith was measured in footsteps, where devotion demanded physical sacrifice, where the sacred could only be reached through exhaustion and perseverance. The mystery of the Lincoln Cathedral skeleton reminds us that even in death, stories can remain unfinished, waiting for the right moment, the right tools, the right questions to reveal their truth. This anonymous pilgrim from Scandinavia finally received, through modern science, the recognition that eluded him in life. His tale encourages us to wonder about all the other anonymous graves scattered across Europe, the countless unknown stories of faith and journey that wait beneath our feet, patient as stone, enduring as the human desire to seek something greater than ourselves. As we drift away from Lincoln Cathedral and its ancient secrets, let our thoughts turn to another mystery that lay hidden not in sacred ground, but beneath the mundane asphalt of a Leicester car park. The search for Richard III, England's last Plantagenet king, had captivated historians and romantics for centuries, a quest that seemed more suited to legend than serious archaeology. Richard III occupies a unique position in English history, a king whose very name conjures images of the hunchbacked villain of Shakespeare's imagination, the uncle who supposedly murdered his young nephews in the Tower of London to secure his grip on the crown. Yet the historical Richard was a far more complex figure than literature would suggest, a man who ruled for only 2 years, but whose death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of Tudor England. When Richard fell on that August morning, cut down by the forces of Henry Tudor in a marshy field in Leicestershire, his body faced an ignominious fate. Medieval kings, even defeated ones, typically received burials befitting their station, elaborate ceremonies that honored the office even when the man was reviled. But Richard's corpse was treated with the casual brutality reserved for traitors and criminals. Stripped, possibly mutilated, and hastily interred, the last Plantagenet king seemed to vanish from history as completely as if he had never existed. For more than 5 centuries, historians debated the location of Richard's remains. Some sources suggested he had been buried at Greyfriars Church in Leicester, a Franciscan friary that had provided a temporary resting place for the fallen king. But the friary had been dissolved during Henry VIII's Reformation, its buildings demolished, its grounds built over and forgotten. The precise location of Richard's grave became one of English history's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. Then, in 2012, a remarkable combination of historical research, archaeological expertise, and sheer determination converged on a most unlikely location. Not in the ruins of a great cathedral or the remains of a royal chapel, but in a perfectly ordinary car park behind the Leicester City Council offices, where office workers parked their vehicles and pedestrians hurried past without a second thought. The archaeologists who undertook this seemingly impossible task were guided by medieval documents that suggested the approximate location of the lost friary. Using ground-penetrating radar and careful historical analysis, they identified the most promising areas within the car park, marking out trenches that would either vindicate their research or prove that some mysteries are truly unsolvable. The excavation itself was a study in patient methodology, each layer of earth removed and catalogued, each fragment of pottery or metal carefully preserved and analyzed. The modern car park had to be peeled away like the pages of a book, revealing beneath its mundane surface the accumulated history of centuries. First came the Victorian layers, the detritus of industrial Leicester, then medieval foundations, the ghostly outlines of walls and floors that had once sheltered praying friars. And then, in a trench that would later be designated simply as Trench 1, the archaeologists uncovered human remains. The skeleton was that of an adult male, his bones bearing the unmistakable signs of violence. The skull showed evidence of severe trauma, wounds that could only have been inflicted by medieval weapons. But most telling of all was the spine, twisted and curved in a manner that immediately brought to mind the literary descriptions of Richard's supposed deformity. Yet, archaeology is not literature, and the scientific analysis of these remains required months of careful study. The bones were subjected to radiocarbon dating, which confirmed they belonged to someone who had died in the late 15th century. The injuries were consistent with wounds inflicted during medieval combat, particularly the kind of brutal hand-to-hand fighting that characterized the final moments of the Battle of Bosworth Field. Perhaps most remarkably, DNA analysis provided the final confirmation of the skeleton's identity. Through a genealogical investigation that traced Richard's maternal lineage across more than 5 centuries, researchers located living descendants who could provide genetic material for comparison. The DNA extracted from the Leicester skeleton matched these distant relatives, confirming beyond reasonable doubt that the remains belonged to Richard III. The discovery transformed our understanding of the last Plantagenet king. The literary hunchback of Shakespeare's imagination proved to be a man with scoliosis, a spinal condition that would have caused discomfort and a slight asymmetry, but nothing approaching the monstrous deformity of popular imagination. The wounds on his skull spoke of a king who had died fighting, not cowering in defeat but facing his enemies with whatever courage remained to him in those final moments. The reburial of Richard III in Leicester Cathedral became a remarkable moment of historical reconciliation. The king, who had been hastily buried in an anonymous grave, whose remains had lain forgotten beneath a car park for more than 5 centuries, finally received the ceremony and recognition that had been denied him in death. The service drew dignitaries and commoners alike, all united by the strange power of a mystery finally solved. Yet the discovery raises as many questions as it answers. The Richard III who emerged from the Leicester car park was neither the villain of legend nor the misunderstood hero that some had hoped to find, but something more complex and human. His story reminds us that history is written by the victors, that the truth often lies buried not just in the earth but beneath layers of propaganda and political necessity. The transformation of a car park into an archaeological site, of mundane urban space into a place of historical pilgrimage, speaks to the strange ways that the past intrudes upon the present. Office workers who had parked their cars unknowingly above a medieval king, pedestrians who had walked daily over one of English history's greatest mysteries, suddenly found themselves part of a story that stretched back through centuries of speculation and wonder. As the Leicester car park fades from our thoughts, let us drift toward another mystery that has puzzled scholars for more than a century, a manuscript so strange and indecipherable that it has been called the most mysterious book in the world. The Voynich manuscript, named after the Polish book dealer who discovered it in 1912, represents perhaps the ultimate puzzle for those who love medieval enigmas. Wilfrid Voynich found the manuscript in the Villa Mondragone near Rome, among a collection of books that had belonged to the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher. Even at first glance, it was clear that this was no ordinary medieval text. Written on vellum, in an elegant but completely unknown script, illustrated with bizarre drawings that seemed to emerge from the fevered imagination of a medieval dreamer, the manuscript defied every attempt at classification or understanding. The contents of the Voynich manuscript read like a catalogue of impossibilities, page after page of text written in flowing, confident handwriting, but in a language that no scholar could identify or decode. The letters themselves seemed familiar yet foreign, as if someone had taken a known alphabet and twisted it into new and incomprehensible forms. Accompanying this mysterious text were illustrations that ranged from the plausible to the utterly fantastical. There were botanical sections filled with drawings of plants that no botanist could identify, species that seemed to blend familiar elements in impossible ways. Root systems sprawled across pages like underground cities, while leaves and flowers combined characteristics from different plant families, as if the artist had been describing flora from another world entirely. Some scholars suggested these might be stylized representations of known plants, medieval artistic conventions that obscured rather than revealed the true identity of the species being depicted. The astronomical sections were equally perplexing, filled with star charts and celestial diagrams that followed no known system of medieval astronomy. Circular designs that might represent zodiacal signs were populated with strange symbols and surrounded by text that maintained its stubborn silence. Whether these represented genuine astronomical observations or the imaginative cosmology of a medieval mystic remained entirely unclear. But perhaps most memorably strange were the biological sections, pages upon pages of illustrations showing naked women bathing in or emerging from elaborate systems of pools, tubes, and chambers. These figures, rendered in the simple but confident style of medieval manuscript illumination, seemed to be participating in some kind of ritual or therapeutic practice that had no parallel in known medieval traditions. The pools and chambers in which they bathed were filled with green or blue liquids, connected by elaborate plumbing systems that suggested some form of hydrotherapy or alchemical process. For decades after its discovery, the Voynich manuscript attracted the attention of cryptographers, historians, and enthusiasts who were convinced that its secrets could be unlocked through sufficient effort and ingenuity. During World War II, codebreakers who had successfully deciphered enemy military communications turned their skills to this medieval puzzle, only to find themselves as baffled as their predecessors. The manuscript seemed to resist every analytical approach, maintaining its silence with the stubborn patience of centuries. Some scholars suggested that the entire manuscript was an elaborate hoax, perhaps created by a clever forger to deceive medieval collectors who prized mysterious and exotic texts. The consistency of the writing style, the apparent logical structure of the unknown language, and the confident artistic execution all suggested someone with considerable skill and patience, but perhaps not genuine medieval origins. Others proposed that the manuscript represented a lost language or writing system, possibly connected to an obscure medieval sect or scholarly tradition that had vanished without leaving other traces. The possibility that an entire linguistic and cultural tradition could disappear so completely seemed remote, but the medieval world was full of communities and practices that had left only fragmentary evidence of their existence. Recent advances in computational linguistics and artificial intelligence have finally begun to crack some of the Voynich manuscript's secrets, though the solutions have proven to be both illuminating and strangely anticlimactic. Analysis of the text's statistical properties, the frequency patterns of letters and words, and the structural relationships between different sections has suggested that the manuscript is indeed written in a real language, not an elaborate cipher or meaningless fabrication. The language appears to be a form of Proto-Romance, an early derivative of Latin that represents a transitional stage between classical Latin and the emerging vernacular languages of medieval Europe. This would place the manuscript's composition in the early centuries of the medieval period, when Latin was evolving into the various Romance languages, but before these new linguistic forms had been standardized or widely recorded in written form. If this identification is correct, then the Voynich manuscript represents an extraordinary linguistic artifact, a window into a stage of language development that historians had previously known only through inference and reconstruction. The mysterious script would then be an attempt to represent this Proto-Romance language in written form, possibly using a writing system that was created specifically for this purpose. The content of the manuscript, when viewed through this linguistic lens, appears to be far more mundane than its mysterious appearance would suggest. Rather than containing the secrets of medieval alchemy or the wisdom of lost civilizations, the Voynich manuscript seems to be a practical handbook, possibly dealing with herbal medicine, women's health, and basic astronomical observations. The naked women in their elaborate bathing systems may represent therapeutic practices, medieval approaches to hygiene and health that were recorded with the matter-of-fact directness that characterized much medieval medical literature. This interpretation transforms the Voynich manuscript from an object of mystical speculation into a historical document of considerable importance. If it truly represents an early attempt to record Proto-Romance language in written form, then it provides insights into linguistic developments that occurred during one of the most formative periods in European cultural history. The manuscript becomes not just a curiosity, but a genuine contribution to our understanding of how medieval peoples thought, spoke, and recorded their knowledge. Yet even as parts of the mystery yield to analysis, much about the Voynich manuscript remains unclear: who created it, and why? What specific community or tradition does it represent? How did such an unusual linguistic and cultural artifact come to be preserved when so many other medieval texts have been lost? The manuscript continues to pose questions that may never be fully answered, a reminder that even our most sophisticated analytical tools can only take us so far into the minds and motivations of people who lived centuries ago. The Voynich manuscript represents the strange persistence of medieval mysteries, the way that objects created in distant times can continue to challenge and puzzle us across the centuries. Whether it ultimately proves to be a groundbreaking linguistic artifact, or simply an unusually elaborate medical handbook, it has already succeeded in one important way. It has reminded us that the medieval world was far more complex, creative, and surprising than our simplified historical narratives often suggest. From the scholarly mystery of the Voynich manuscript, let our thoughts drift to a tale that sounds more like folklore than history, yet which has its own surprising resolution rooted in the harsh realities of medieval life. In the 12th century, in the small Suffolk village of Woolpit, two children appeared under circumstances so strange that chroniclers of the time struggled to find adequate words to describe what they had witnessed. The children simply materialized, as if the earth itself had given birth to them in the fields outside the village. There were no parents, no explanation, no context that might help the villagers understand where these young strangers had come from, or how they had arrived in Woolpit. But most remarkably, most impossibly, the children's skin was green, not the pale complexion of English villagers, but a distinct verdant hue that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Medieval chroniclers, men like Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, were trained observers who understood the importance of accurate recording, yet they found themselves documenting something that challenged the very boundaries of natural possibility. These were not men given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation, but serious historians who recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience. The children spoke no recognizable language. When the villagers attempted to communicate with them, offering the universal gestures of welcome and comfort, the green-skinned pair responded with sounds and words that bore no resemblance to English, Latin, or any of the other languages that might be heard in a 12th century English village. Their clothing, too, was strange, fashioned from materials and in styles that the villagers could not identify. But perhaps most troubling of all was the children's refusal to eat. The villagers, moved by Christian charity and basic human compassion, offered bread, milk, meat, and all the other staples of medieval diet. But the green children rejected everything placed before them. They seemed to be starving, growing weaker, and more distressed with each passing day, yet they would not accept the nourishment that could save their lives. Only when someone, perhaps by accident or desperation, offered them raw beans did the children show any interest in food. They consumed the beans with an eagerness that spoke of profound hunger, and for a time it seemed that this single food item might sustain them. The villagers, perhaps reasoning that any nourishment was better than starvation, provided beans in abundance, watching as the strange green children slowly began to regain their strength. The boy, sadly, did not survive long. Medieval childhood was precarious under the best of circumstances, and whatever ordeal had brought the green children to Woolpit had already taken a terrible toll on his small body. He died within weeks of his arrival, his brief life adding another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible situation. The villagers buried him in the churchyard, probably with the same mixture of compassion and uneasiness that had marked their interactions with the living children. The girl, however, proved more resilient. As she continued to eat regular food rather than subsisting solely on beans, a remarkable transformation began to occur. The green tinge that had made her so extraordinary gradually faded from her skin, replaced by the normal pale complexion of an English child. It was as if the strange coloration had been not a permanent characteristic but a symptom, something that could be corrected through proper nutrition and care. As her appearance normalized, so did her ability to communicate. She began to learn English, slowly acquiring the words and phrases that would allow her to tell her story to the curious villagers who had become her caregivers. What she eventually revealed was both more mundane and more poignant than the supernatural explanations that many had imagined. According to her account, She and her brother had come from a land of perpetual twilight, a place where the sun never shone brightly, and the sky remained in constant semi-darkness. They had been tending to their father's cattle when they became lost, following what they thought was the sound of church bells through a cave or tunnel that led them, somehow, to the bright fields of Woolpit. Modern historians and medical experts have proposed explanations for the green children that root the story firmly in the harsh realities of 12th century life. The most likely scenario involves Flemish refugees, children whose families had been displaced by the political and military conflicts that frequently disrupted medieval Europe. During the 12th century there were indeed significant population movements as people fled warfare, famine, and persecution. These refugee children, separated from their families through some tragic circumstance, might have wandered for days or weeks through unfamiliar countryside, sustaining themselves on whatever food they could find. Severe malnutrition, particularly a diet consisting primarily of green vegetables, or in this case perhaps only whatever wild plants they could identify as safe to eat, could indeed cause a greenish discoloration of the skin, a condition known as hyperchromic anemia. The children's unfamiliarity with English food, their inability to communicate in the local language, and their general disorientation would all be consistent with refugee children from a Flemish-speaking region. The story of the land of perpetual twilight might represent a child's attempt to describe an unfamiliar landscape, perhaps the dense forests of northern Europe, where thick canopy cover creates an environment of constant shadow. The green children of Woolpit remind us that medieval life was filled with movements of people fleeing disaster, seeking safety, or simply trying to survive in a world where political boundaries shifted frequently and violently. Children separated from their families in such circumstances faced challenges that would test the limits of human endurance, and their survival often depended on the charity of strangers who might be as baffled by their appearance as they were moved by their plight. Yet the story also speaks to the medieval capacity for wonder, the willingness of chroniclers to record the extraordinary, alongside the mundane, to preserve accounts that challenged conventional understanding rather than dismissing them as impossible. Whether the green children were supernatural visitors, or simply refugee children suffering from malnutrition, their story has survived because medieval writers recognized its significance, its power to illuminate something important about the world they inhabited. The transformation of the surviving girl from a green-skinned mystery into an ordinary English villager parallels the way that many medieval mysteries yield their secrets. When examined with modern understanding, what seems supernatural or impossible often proves to have rational explanations rooted in the social, economic, and medical realities of medieval life. Yet these explanations do not diminish the human drama of the original events, the courage of villagers who offered sanctuary to strange children, or the resilience of a young girl who survived displacement, starvation, and the loss of everything familiar to build a new life in an alien place. As the green children fade into the twilight of memory, let us turn our attention to the stone walls of medieval English churches, where another kind of mystery has puzzled historians for generations. Carved into the soft limestone and sandstone of these sacred buildings, often hidden in shadowy corners or tucked away near forgotten altars, are thousands of strange markings that have been interpreted as everything from demonic protection symbols to the idle doodles of bored parishioners. For centuries these markings attracted the attention of Victorian antiquarians who were convinced that they represented evidence of widespread medieval practices of magical protection. The symbols seemed to speak of a world haunted by supernatural threats, where ordinary villagers felt the need to carve protective wards into the very walls of their churches to guard against demons, witches, and malevolent spirits. The markings themselves are diverse and puzzling. Some take the form of intersecting circles, geometric patterns that might represent attempts to trap evil spirits within symbolic mazes from which they could not escape. Others resemble stars or celestial symbols, possibly invoking the protection of heavenly powers against earthly threats. Many are crude crosses or religious symbols, while others appear to be letters or even words, though often rendered in scripts or languages that are difficult to identify. Victorian scholars, working during a period when interest in folklore and supernatural beliefs was at its height, interpreted these carvings through the lens of their own fascination with medieval superstition. They imagined a world where ordinary people lived in constant fear of supernatural attack, where the line between Christian faith and pagan magic remained blurred, where the very stones of sacred buildings had to be enlisted in the struggle against evil. This interpretation gained credibility from the obvious age of many of the carvings, which appeared to date from the medieval period, and from their location within churches, which seemed to suggest that they were connected to religious or spiritual practices. The fact that many of the symbols were carved in positions where they would not be easily visible to casual observers added to their mysterious aura, suggesting that they were part of secret or hidden traditions that operated alongside official church doctrine. However, recent systematic studies of medieval church graffiti have revealed a far more complex and ultimately more human story. Rather than being evidence of widespread magical practices, the majority of these carvings appear to represent the same kinds of casual marking that people have always made when they find themselves in spaces where they have time on their hands and access to surfaces that can be carved. Archaeological surveys that have documented over 28,000 examples of medieval graffiti have found that many of the mysterious symbols are actually quite mundane. Names and initials predominate, often accompanied by dates that allow historians to track the presence of particular individuals in specific churches over time. Some of the most elaborate carvings prove to be simple artistic exercises, attempts by skilled craftsmen to practice their techniques or demonstrate their abilities on available stone surfaces. The geometric patterns that Victorian scholars interpreted as protective magic often prove to be compass-drawn designs, the kind of decorative elements that medieval masons used to practice their trade or to work out proportional relationships for larger architectural projects. The star-like symbols frequently represent traditional Christian iconography, simplified versions of the kinds of decorative elements that appeared in illuminated manuscripts and church furnishings. Even the more unusual carvings, when examined in their historical context, often prove to have perfectly rational explanations. Medieval churches served not just as places of worship but as community centers, meeting spaces where villagers gathered for everything from legal proceedings to social celebrations. During long services or community meetings, it would have been natural for people to occupy their hands and minds by carving simple designs or writing their names into available surfaces. The practice of leaving marks in churches also had legitimate devotional purposes that had nothing to do with magic or supernatural protection. Medieval Christians often carved crosses or religious symbols as acts of prayer or commemoration, permanent records of their presence in sacred space that would continue to offer devotion long after they had departed. These carved prayers represented a form of persistent worship, a way of ensuring that one's devotion would continue to rise toward heaven even when one's body was occupied elsewhere. Some of the carvings clearly represent votive offerings, markers left by pilgrims or worshippers to commemorate answered prayers, successful journeys, or important life events. The practice of leaving such permanent marks in sacred spaces was an accepted part of medieval religious culture, a way of participating in the ongoing life of the church community, even across spans of time. The revelation that medieval church graffiti was primarily the product of ordinary human impulses rather than supernatural beliefs does not diminish its historical importance. If anything, these casual markings provide us with a more intimate and immediate connection to medieval people than formal historical documents ever could. They represent moments of individual presence, instances when particular people took the time to assert their existence and leave a permanent mark of their passage through sacred space. The names carved into church walls speak of medieval communities in ways that official records rarely capture. We see the same individuals appearing in multiple locations, suggesting patterns of travel and pilgrimage that illuminate the mobility of medieval populations. We find evidence of literacy in unexpected places, as ordinary villagers demonstrate their ability to write their names and sometimes longer texts in stone. The artistic quality of many carvings reveals the presence of skilled craftsmen who were willing to practice their art in informal settings, suggesting that the boundary between professional and amateur artistic production was more fluid than historians have sometimes assumed. The decorative patterns and religious symbols show how artistic and spiritual traditions were transmitted at the grassroots level, how ordinary people participated in the visual culture of their time. Perhaps most importantly, the ubiquity of medieval church graffiti reminds us that sacred spaces were genuinely communal, places where people felt comfortable asserting their individual presence while participating in collective worship. The willingness of medieval people to carve their marks into church walls suggests a sense of ownership and belonging that goes beyond formal membership in religious communities. The study of medieval church graffiti illustrates the way that modern analytical techniques can transform our understanding of historical practices, revealing the human reality that often lies beneath layers of romantic interpretation. The Victorian scholars who saw magical protection in every carved symbol were not entirely wrong to sense mystery in these markings, but the true mystery lies not in supernatural beliefs but in the ordinary human impulse to leave a mark, to assert presence, to participate in the ongoing life of community and faith. From the carved stones of English churches, let our thoughts drift across the North Sea to the treacherous waters, where legend spoke of a prosperous city that vanished beneath the waves in a single night. Rungholt, often called the Atlantis of the North, occupied a unique place in German folklore as a cautionary tale about divine justice and human hubris. Yet recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that this legendary city was far more real than anyone had dared to imagine. The story of Rungholt, as preserved in Low German ballads and local traditions, painted a picture of extraordinary prosperity and equally extraordinary sin. According to legend, the city was a major trading port in the 14th century, blessed with advanced engineering that allowed it to thrive in the challenging environment of the North Frisian coast. Its citizens had grown wealthy through maritime commerce, but their success had bred arrogance and godlessness that eventually called down divine punishment. The legendary account describes a city where Christian virtue had been abandoned in favor of material excess and moral corruption. The citizens of Rungholt were said to be so wealthy that they stabled their horses with silver and used gold as common metal for everyday objects. More damningly, they had become cruel to the poor and hostile to religious authority, refusing Christian charity and mocking the representatives of the church. The tale reaches its climax with the arrival of a priest who seeks shelter in the city, but is turned away by every household, refused even the most basic hospitality despite his obvious need. In some versions of the story, the citizens go so far as to mock the priest openly, treating him with contempt and derision that violates every principle of medieval Christian charity. The priest, revealed to be a divine messenger in disguise, pronounces a curse upon the city, declaring that its pride and cruelty will bring about its destruction. The punishment, when it comes, takes the form of a massive storm surge, the kind of catastrophic flood that periodically devastated the low-lying coastlands of the North Sea. In the ballads, the destruction is complete and immediate. The waves rise higher than any previously recorded, overwhelming the dikes and seawalls that had protected the city, sweeping away buildings, streets, and people in a single night of divine wrath. By morning, Rungholt has vanished entirely, leaving only empty water where a prosperous city had stood. For centuries this story was treated as purely legendary, a moral tale designed to reinforce Christian values rather than a historical account of actual events. The complete disappearance of such a supposedly large and prosperous city seemed implausible, and no contemporary historical records seemed to corroborate the existence of a major trading centre called Rungholt in the North Frisian region. Skeptics pointed out that the story contained many elements typical of folk tales rather than historical accounts. The supernatural punishment of sin, the complete destruction that leaves no survivors to tell the tale, the moral clarity that divides characters into pure good and absolute evil. The legend of Rungholt seemed to belong to the same category as stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, cautionary tales that use dramatic narratives to reinforce religious and social values. However, recent advances in marine archaeology and underwater exploration have begun to reveal evidence that suggests Rungholt was far more than mere legend. Using sophisticated sonar mapping, aerial photography, and direct underwater excavation, researchers have identified substantial archaeological remains beneath the waters of the Wadden Sea, evidence of human settlement and sophisticated engineering that corresponds remarkably well with the legendary accounts of the lost city. The archaeological evidence reveals a complex system of dikes, drainage channels, and settlement mounds that speaks to a highly organized society capable of large-scale environmental engineering. The remains of stone and wooden structures suggest permanent buildings designed to withstand the challenging conditions of coastal settlement in a region where sea level and weather patterns were constantly threatening human habitation. Most remarkably, the archaeological evidence confirms that this substantial settlement was indeed destroyed by flooding, but the reality proves to be both more complex and more mundane than the legendary account suggests. Rather than being the result of divine judgment, the destruction of Rungholt appears to have been caused by a combination of environmental and social factors that illustrate the precarious nature of medieval coastal settlement. The 14th century was a period of significant climate change in northern Europe, with rising sea levels, increased storm activity, and shifts in weather patterns that placed extraordinary stress on coastal communities. The advanced dike systems that had allowed settlements like Rungholt to prosper were designed for earlier environmental conditions and proved inadequate when faced with unprecedented challenges. The Great Storm of 1362, known historically as the Groot Mandrinki, or Great Drowning of Men, was a real meteorological event that devastated coastal regions from the Netherlands to Denmark. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that this storm surge was unlike anything in living memory, overwhelming coastal defenses and permanently altering the geography of the North Sea coast. Archaeological evidence suggests that Rungholt and similar settlements were already under severe stress before the final catastrophe. The remains show evidence of repeated flooding, emergency repairs to defensive structures, and gradual abandonment of outlying areas as the sea steadily encroached on human settlement. The final destruction in 1362 was not a sudden divine punishment, but the culmination of a longer process of environmental change that made continued habitation impossible. The real tragedy of Rungholt lies not in legendary moral failings, but in the harsh reality of medieval environmental vulnerability. The sophisticated engineering that had allowed the city to prosper was ultimately insufficient to protect it against the combined challenges of climate change and extreme weather. The fate of Rungholt illustrates the precarious relationship between human settlement and natural forces in an age when technology and social organization were not yet adequate to provide complete security against environmental threats. The archaeological recovery of Rungholt transforms it from a legendary warning about divine justice into a historical example of environmental catastrophe and human resilience. The city that emerges from underwater excavation is not the morally corrupt community of legend, but a sophisticated medieval settlement that represents one of the most advanced examples of coastal engineering in northern Europe. The citizens of Rungholt appear to have been skilled hydraulic engineers who understood the challenges of their environment and developed innovative solutions for managing water levels, drainage, and flood protection. Their failure was not moral, but technological, the inevitable result of attempting to maintain permanent settlement in an environment that was becoming increasingly hostile to human habitation. The legend of Rungholt, with its emphasis on divine punishment for moral failings, reflects the medieval tendency to interpret natural disasters through religious and moral frameworks. When faced with catastrophic events that exceeded their ability to understand or control, medieval people naturally sought explanations that connected physical events to spiritual causes, finding in environmental disasters evidence of divine judgment and moral instruction. Yet the archaeological reality of Rungholt suggests a more complex relationship between human society and natural forces, one that acknowledges both the remarkable ingenuity of medieval engineering and the ultimate limits of human ability to control environmental change. The city beneath the waves stands as a monument not to human sin but to human ambition, a reminder that even our most impressive achievements remain vulnerable to forces beyond our control. From the submerged remains of Rungholt, let us drift toward the shadows of a cave system in Shropshire, where another medieval mystery has captured imaginations and spawned countless theories about secret societies and hidden knowledge. The Cainton Caves, with their elaborate carved chambers and mysterious atmosphere, have long been associated with the Knights Templar and their supposed secret rituals, yet recent investigation has revealed a story that is both more recent and more complex than the medieval legends would suggest. The caves themselves are undeniably atmospheric, carved into sandstone bedrock to create a series of interconnected chambers and passageways that feel like something from a medieval romance or Gothic novel. The main chamber features intricately carved pillars and arches that create dramatic lighting effects when illuminated by candles or torches. Narrow passages connect this central space to smaller chambers and alcoves, creating a layout that seems designed for ceremonial purposes. The architectural style of the caves draws heavily on medieval Gothic themes, with pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, and decorative stonework that creates an unmistakably ecclesiastical atmosphere. The quality of the carving is sophisticated, showing evidence of skilled craftsmanship and careful planning rather than the rough work of amateur excavators. The overall effect is of a sacred space, an underground chapel or ceremonial hall, designed for activities that required both secrecy and solemnity. These characteristics naturally led to speculation about the cave's origins and purpose. The combination of underground location, medieval styling, and sophisticated craftsmanship seemed to point toward use by secret religious or military organizations, groups that would have had both the resources to undertake such elaborate construction and the need for concealed meeting spaces. The Knights Templar provided an obvious candidate for such speculation. As a military religious order that was officially disbanded in the early 14th century, amid accusations of heresy and secret practices, the Templars had become legendary figures associated with hidden knowledge, secret rituals, and clandestine survival. The idea that Templar survivors might have carved underground meeting halls and continued their practices in secret was appealing to those who were fascinated by conspiracy theories and medieval mysteries. The Cainton Caves seemed to fit this narrative perfectly. Their Gothic styling recalled the architectural preferences of medieval religious orders, while their underground location suggested the kind of secrecy that disbanded or persecuted groups might have required. The elaborate nature of the construction implied resources and organization that could plausibly be associated with survivors of a powerful medieval institution. However, careful archaeological and historical analysis has revealed that the caves are almost certainly much more recent than their medieval styling would suggest. The techniques used in their construction, the specific architectural details, and the way the stone has weathered all point to creation during the 18th or 19th centuries rather than the medieval period. This dating places the caves squarely within the period of the Romantic movement, when there was widespread fascination with medieval themes and Gothic architecture. The 18th and 19th centuries saw numerous examples of Gothic revival construction, projects that deliberately imitated medieval styles for aesthetic or atmospheric reasons, rather than representing authentic medieval work. The most likely explanation for the Cainton Caves is that they represent a private project undertaken by someone with sufficient wealth, interest in medieval themes, and desire for a dramatic meeting space or folly. Such projects were not uncommon among the wealthy landowners of the period, who often created elaborate artificial ruins, hermitages, or grottos on their estates as conversation pieces or settings for entertaining. The caves may have been used by various esoteric or quasi-religious groups during the 19th and 20th centuries, organizations that were attracted by the atmospheric setting and the suggestions of ancient mystery. Such groups were common during periods when there was renewed interest in spiritualism, alternative religion, or historical romance, and they often sought out locations that could provide the kind of dramatic atmosphere that the Cainton Caves offer. Modern usage of the caves has included visits from contemporary pagans, Goths, and others who are attracted by their mysterious atmosphere and supposed historical connections. The caves have also become popular with photographers and filmmakers who appreciate their dramatic lighting and Gothic ambiance for various creative projects. The persistence of Templar legends connected to the Cainton Caves illustrate the powerful appeal of medieval mystery and the tendency for later periods to project their own fascinations onto ambiguous historical sites. The Victorian and Edwardian periods, when many of the most elaborate Templar theories were developed, were times of intense interest in medieval history, secret societies, and alternative spirituality. During this period, the historical Knights Templar were transformed from a specific medieval military religious order into symbols of hidden knowledge and esoteric wisdom. This transformation owed more to romantic imagination than to historical evidence, but it proved remarkably durable and continues to influence popular perceptions of medieval history. The Cainton Caves represent a physical manifestation of this romanticized vision of medieval mystery. Even if they are not genuinely medieval, they embody the 19th century understanding of what medieval secret societies might have been like, complete with underground meeting places, Gothic architecture, and an atmosphere of hidden knowledge and clandestine ritual. In this sense, the caves are historically significant, not as genuine medieval artifacts, but as examples of how later periods interpreted and reimagined medieval history. They illustrate the way that historical understanding is always shaped by the interests and assumptions of those doing the interpreting, and how physical spaces can be created to embody particular visions of the past. The mystery of the Cainton Caves reminds us that not all historical puzzles have ancient origins. Sometimes the most intriguing questions arise from the ways that different historical periods have understood and reconstructed their own past, creating new mysteries in the process of trying to solve old ones. As we move away from the manufactured mystery of the Cainton Caves, let us turn toward one of medieval England's most enduring and tragic puzzles, the fate of the princes in the Tower. This mystery has captivated historians, novelists, and the general public for more than 5 centuries, representing perhaps the most famous unsolved crime in English history. Yet recent advances in forensic science may finally offer the possibility of definitive answers. The story begins in the spring of 1483, when 12-year-old Edward V ascended to the throne of England following the death of his father, Edward IV. As a minor, the young king required a regent to govern in his name, and this role naturally fell to his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was both the late king's brother and one of the most powerful nobles in the realm. Richard's assumption of the regency seemed straightforward enough, but the political situation was far more complex than it initially appeared. The late king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had created a powerful faction centered around the Queen's family, a group that viewed Richard with suspicion and concern. There were also questions about the legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage, issues that would later be used to justify dramatic political changes. For reasons that remain debated by historians, Richard decided that the young king and his younger brother, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, needed to be housed in the Tower of London for their protection. The Tower, despite its later reputation as a prison, was at this time a royal residence and fortress where important members of the royal family were traditionally lodged during periods of political uncertainty. Initially, this arrangement seemed reasonable and even prudent. The Tower was the most secure location in London, staffed by loyal servants and defended by trusted guards. The young princes could be kept safe from any potential threats, while the details of the regency and the coronation were arranged. Regular reports suggested that the boys were in good health and spirits, playing in the Tower gardens and receiving visitors according to their station. However, as the summer of 1483 progressed, these reassuring reports gradually ceased. Witnesses who had previously seen the princes exercising in the Tower grounds or appearing at windows began to notice their absence. Inquiries about their well-being received increasingly evasive responses from those responsible for their care. By autumn, it was clear that something had happened to the young princes, though exactly what remained unclear. The political context of their disappearance was dominated by Richard's own assumption of the crown. In June 1483, he had claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, making their children illegitimate and removing young Edward IV's claim to the throne. Richard was crowned as Richard III in July, justifying his action as necessary to prevent the realm from being governed by an illegitimate minor. From a purely political perspective, Richard's usurpation could be defended as a practical solution to a potentially dangerous situation. A minority reign always created opportunities for factional conflict and civil war, particularly when there were questions about legitimacy and competing claims to influence over the young king. By taking the crown himself, Richard could argue that he was providing the strong leadership that the realm required. However, the disappearance of the princes created a far more sinister interpretation of these events. If Richard had murdered his nephews to secure his claim to the throne, then his actions represented not political pragmatism, but calculated fratricide, one of the most heinous crimes imaginable in a society that placed enormous emphasis on family loyalty and the protection of children. The evidence for what actually happened to the princes remains frustratingly incomplete. Contemporary chronicles provide conflicting accounts, some suggesting that the boys died of natural causes, others hinting at murder, still others maintaining diplomatic silence about their fate. The political upheaval that followed Richard's reign meant that many records were destroyed or altered, making it difficult to establish a clear chronology of events. The traditional narrative, established primarily during the Tudor period, presents Richard III as the obvious culprit in his nephew's deaths. This interpretation was powerfully reinforced by Shakespeare's dramatic portrayal of Richard as a calculating villain who murdered the innocent princes to secure his own power. However, modern historians have raised questions about this neat assignment of guilt, pointing out that other individuals also benefited from the prince's disappearance. Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 and became Henry VII, had perhaps even stronger motives for ensuring that the princes did not survive. As long as Edward V and his brother lived, they represented alternative claimants to the throne whose legitimacy could potentially be restored by political changes. Henry's own claim to the crown was relatively weak, based primarily on conquest rather than clear hereditary right. If Henry VII was responsible for the princes' deaths, this would explain why their fate remained mysterious even after Richard III's defeat. A king who had murdered children to secure his throne would hardly wish to advertise his crimes, and the propaganda value of blaming the defeated Richard would have been enormous. The disappearance of the princes could thus be attributed to the previous regime, while their actual fate remained hidden. The physical evidence for the prince's fate has been tantalizingly incomplete for centuries. In 1674, workmen repairing a staircase in the Tower of London discovered a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 children. The remains were assumed to be those of the missing princes, and were reinterred in Westminster Abbey with appropriate ceremony, but no scientific analysis was undertaken to confirm their identity. Modern forensic science offers techniques that could potentially resolve this centuries-old mystery definitively. DNA analysis of the Westminster Abbey remains, compared with samples from known royal descendants, could confirm whether the skeletons belonged to Edward V and his brother. Radiocarbon dating could establish when the children died, while detailed forensic examination might reveal the cause of death. However, such analysis would require permission from both the Crown and the Church of England to disturb the remains that have rested in Westminster Abbey for more than 3 centuries. The political and religious sensitivities involved in such a decision are considerable, and there has been ongoing debate about whether the potential historical benefits justify the disruption of what are considered consecrated remains. The mystery of the princes in the tower represents more than just an unsolved historical crime. It embodies fundamental questions about power, legitimacy, and the price of political ambition in medieval England. Whether the princes were murdered by their uncle, by his successor, or by unknown agents acting on behalf of various political factions, their disappearance marked a critical moment in English history, when the stability of the monarchy was tested by competing claims and violent ambition. The possibility that modern science might finally resolve this medieval mystery creates both excitement and anxiety among historians and the general public. A definitive answer about the prince's fate would close one of history's most famous cold cases, but it might also challenge deeply held assumptions about one of the most dramatic periods in English history. The story of the princes in the tower reminds us that historical mysteries often persist not because the truth is impossible to discover, but because the social, political, and cultural implications of that truth are too complex or controversial to address directly. Sometimes the most important historical questions are not just about what happened, but about why we continue to find certain possibilities unthinkable or unacceptable. From the political intrigue of medieval England, let our thoughts drift to a different kind of mystery, one that emerged from the streets of Strasbourg in 1518, and has puzzled historians and medical experts ever since. The dancing plague represents one of the most bizarre collective phenomena in recorded history, an event so strange that contemporary accounts strain credibility even as they provide detailed documentation of something genuinely unprecedented. The outbreak began with a single woman, Frau Trophea, who stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg one July morning and began to dance. This was not the celebratory dancing of festivals or the structured movements of court entertainment, but something far more disturbing and compulsive. Contemporary witnesses described her movements as frenzied and involuntary, as if she were being controlled by some external force that compelled her to continue dancing regardless of exhaustion or pain. Within hours, other people began to join her, not in a spirit of celebration or imitation, but apparently seized by the same compulsive need to dance that had overcome Frau Trophea. By the end of the first day, several dozen people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, their movements becoming increasingly erratic and desperate as exhaustion began to take its toll. The phenomenon spread with alarming speed. Within a week, contemporary accounts suggest that more than 100 people had been affected by the dancing compulsion. Within a month, some reports claim that as many as 400 citizens of Strasbourg were dancing uncontrollably in the city's streets and squares, their movements having transformed from individual episodes into a mass spectacle that disrupted normal urban life. The physical toll of this prolonged dancing was severe and increasingly visible. People collapsed from exhaustion, their feet bleeding from continuous movement on stone streets, their bodies showing signs of dehydration and malnutrition as the compulsion to dance overrode normal needs for rest and nourishment. Some dancers reportedly died from heart attacks or strokes brought on by the extreme physical exertion, while others suffered injuries from falling or colliding with objects or other dancers. The response of local authorities revealed both the medical understanding and social assumptions of early 16th century urban society. Rather than interpreting the dancing as a medical emergency or social disorder, many officials and physicians concluded that the afflicted individuals were suffering from hot blood, a condition that could best be treated by allowing the excess energy to burn itself out through continued dancing. Acting on this medical theory, the city authorities constructed stages in public squares and hired professional musicians to provide accompaniment for the afflicted dancers. The reasoning was that organized, rhythmic dancing would be more effective than chaotic individual movement in restoring the dancers to normal physical and mental balance. This intervention transformed the dancing plague from a spontaneous outbreak into a sponsored public spectacle. The results of this official response were counterproductive and possibly tragic. Rather than helping the dancers recover, the provision of music and stages seems to have intensified and prolonged the phenomenon. More people may have been drawn into the dancing, either through psychological contagion or because the official response legitimized and encouraged behavior that might otherwise have been suppressed through social pressure. Contemporary religious and medical authorities proposed various explanations for the outbreak, most of which reflected the dominant intellectual frameworks of the early 16th century. Some blamed demonic possession, arguing that the dancers had been seized by evil spirits that compelled them to perform unholy movements as a form of torment or punishment. This interpretation led to exorcism attempts and religious interventions designed to drive out the supernatural forces that were supposedly controlling the victims. Others proposed medical explanations based on the humoral theory that dominated Renaissance medicine. According to this framework, the dancing was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, particularly an excess of blood or yellow bile that created internal heat and restlessness. Treatment based on this theory involved bloodletting, purging, and other techniques designed to restore humoral balance. A third category of explanation focused on astrological influences, suggesting that unusual planetary alignments or celestial events had created conditions that made people susceptible to involuntary dancing. This interpretation led to careful observation of astronomical phenomena and attempts to predict when the dancing compulsion might naturally subside. Modern medical and psychological research has proposed more scientifically grounded explanations for the Strasbourg dancing plague that take into account both the social conditions of early 16th century Europe and our current understanding of mass psychological phenomena. Two primary theories have emerged, each supported by different types of evidence and addressing different aspects of the documented outbreak. The first theory focuses on mass psychogenic illness, also known as collective hysteria or conversion disorder. This phenomenon occurs when psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through social networks, particularly in close-knit communities under severe stress. The early 16th century was a period of particular hardship in the Strasbourg region, with recurring famines, political instability, and religious upheaval creating conditions of chronic stress and anxiety. Under such circumstances, the appearance of unexplained physical symptoms in one individual can trigger similar symptoms in others, through a process of unconscious imitation and shared anxiety. The dancing compulsion could thus be understood as a collective expression of psychological distress, a way for a community under severe stress to express and share their emotional burdens through physical movement. This interpretation is supported by the pattern of the outbreak, which began with individuals who were likely under particular stress and spread through social networks rather than randomly through the population. The fact that the phenomenon was limited to Strasbourg and did not spread to neighboring communities suggests that local social conditions were crucial in creating the circumstances that allowed the dancing compulsion to develop and persist. The second major theory focuses on ergot poisoning, a condition caused by consuming grain contaminated with the fungus Claviceps purpura. This fungus produces alkaloids that are chemically similar to LSD and can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and involuntary muscle movements when consumed in significant quantities. Ergot poisoning was a recurring problem in medieval and early modern Europe, particularly during years when weather conditions favored the growth of the fungus on grain crops. The symptoms of ergot poisoning can include muscle spasms, seizures, and uncontrolled movements that might be interpreted as dancing, particularly by observers who were unfamiliar with the effects of the toxin. If contaminated grain had been distributed widely in Strasbourg during the period leading up to the dancing outbreak, this could explain both the large number of people affected and the specific nature of their symptoms. However, the ergot poisoning theory faces some difficulties in explaining the specific characteristics of the Strasbourg outbreak. Ergot poisoning typically affects people randomly based on their consumption of contaminated grain, rather than spreading through social networks as the dancing plague appears to have done. Additionally, ergot poisoning usually produces a range of symptoms beyond involuntary movement, and contemporary accounts of the dancing plague do not consistently describe the other effects that would be expected from significant ergot exposure. The most likely explanation for the Strasbourg dancing plague probably involves a combination of both psychological and physiological factors, with mass psychogenic illness providing the primary mechanism for the outbreak's spread, while nutritional deficiencies, possibly including mild ergot exposure, created physical conditions that made individuals more susceptible to developing movement disorders. The social and economic stress of early 16th century life in Strasbourg would have created the psychological conditions necessary for mass hysteria to develop, while poor nutrition and possible exposure to various toxins would have made the population more vulnerable to developing physical symptoms. The interaction between these factors could have produced the unique combination of voluntary and involuntary movement that characterized the dancing plague. The response of local authorities, particularly their decision to provide music and encourage continued dancing, demonstrates how well-intentioned interventions based on inadequate understanding can exacerbate, rather than resolve, crisis situations. The officials who hired musicians and built stages were attempting to help the afflicted dancers based on their best understanding of medical theory, but their actions may have prolonged and intensified the very phenomenon they were trying to cure. The Strasbourg dancing plague illustrates the complex relationship between individual psychology, social conditions, and physical health in determining how communities respond to crisis situations. It reminds us that seemingly inexplicable historical events often become more understandable when we consider the full range of factors that influence the people who experience them, including psychological stress, social dynamics, medical knowledge, and environmental conditions. The mystery of the dancing plague also demonstrates the importance of considering multiple explanatory frameworks when trying to understand historical phenomena that seem to defy rational explanation. Rather than searching for a single cause or dismissing strange events as impossible, historians and scientists can often gain deeper insights by examining how different factors might have interacted to produce outcomes that seem extraordinary when viewed in isolation. From the frenzied streets of Strasbourg, let us turn our attention to a very different kind of medieval figure, one whose life embodied both the harsh realities of medieval medicine and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Baldwin IV, known to history as the Leper King of Jerusalem, ruled one of the most precarious kingdoms in medieval Europe while battling a disease that should have killed him in childhood. Baldwin's story begins in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem during the second half of the 12th century, a time when the Christian states established during the First Crusade were under increasing pressure from Muslim forces, led by the brilliant military commander Saladin. Into this world of constant warfare and political instability was born a prince who seemed destined for greatness, until a childhood diagnosis changed the trajectory of his life forever. The discovery of Baldwin's condition came through a seemingly innocent childhood incident that revealed something terrifying about the young prince's health. During play with other noble children, Baldwin showed no reaction to pain that should have been excruciating, leading his tutors to realize that he was suffering from a progressive loss of sensation that could only mean one thing: leprosy, one of the most feared diseases of the medieval world. In the 12th century, a diagnosis of leprosy was effectively a death sentence, not just medically but socially and politically. Lepers were required to live apart from normal society, to announce their presence with bells or clappers, to avoid contact with healthy individuals, except under strictly controlled circumstances. For a member of the royal family, leprosy meant not just personal suffering, but the end of any possibility of political leadership or dynastic continuation. Yet Baldwin's case proved to be extraordinary in almost every respect. Rather than dying quickly, as most leprosy sufferers did, he survived to adulthood and beyond. Rather than being removed from political life, he ascended to the throne of Jerusalem at the age of 13 and ruled effectively for more than a decade. Rather than being incapacitated by his disease, he personally led armies in battle and proved to be one of the most capable military commanders of his generation. The nature of Baldwin's illness has been the subject of considerable historical and medical speculation. Contemporary accounts describe a progressive loss of sensation and mobility, beginning with his hands and gradually affecting other parts of his body. Over time, he lost the ability to use his hands effectively, then his arms, and eventually required assistance to mount a horse or hold a sword. Yet throughout this physical deterioration, his mental faculties remained sharp and his political judgment sound. Recent medical analysis of the historical descriptions of Baldwin's condition suggests that he may not have suffered from leprosy in the traditional sense, but from a related but distinct neurological condition. The specific progression of his symptoms, particularly the pattern of nerve damage and muscle weakness, is more consistent with tuberculoid leprosy, a milder form of Hansen's disease that affects peripheral nerves, rather than causing the dramatic physical deformities typically associated with lepromatous leprosy. Alternatively, Baldwin may have suffered from a completely different neurological disorder that was misdiagnosed as leprosy by medieval physicians who lacked the diagnostic tools to distinguish between various conditions that caused similar symptoms. Conditions such as Charcot-Marie tooth disease or other hereditary neuropathies can cause progressive weakness and sensory loss that might have been interpreted as leprosy in a period when medical understanding of neurological disorders was extremely limited. Whatever the precise nature of his medical condition, Baldwin's ability to function as an effective ruler while battling progressive physical disability represents one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval political history. He inherited the throne during a period of extreme military pressure from Saladin's forces, when the survival of the Crusader kingdom depended on strong leadership and strategic brilliance. Baldwin's military campaigns demonstrate both his personal courage and his adaptation to the limitations imposed by his condition. As his physical disabilities progressed, he developed new ways of participating in warfare, eventually commanding from a litter when he could no longer ride a horse, but continuing to make strategic decisions and inspire his troops through his presence on the battlefield. The Battle of Montkezard in 1177 represents perhaps the pinnacle of Baldwin's military achievements. Despite being severely weakened by his illness and only 16 years old, he led a desperate charge against Saladin's much larger army and achieved a victory that temporarily secured the kingdom's survival. Contemporary accounts describe him being lifted onto his horse and supported in the saddle as he led his troops into battle, his physical frailty transformed into a symbol of spiritual strength and determination. Baldwin's political skills proved equally important to his kingdom's survival. He navigated the complex factional politics of the Crusader states with remarkable dexterity, balancing the competing interests of different noble families, military orders, and foreign supporters, while maintaining the coherence necessary for effective defense against external threats. His court became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars and artists from across Europe and the Mediterranean world. The king's personal relationships reveal the human dimension of his extraordinary life. Despite his condition and the social stigma attached to leprosy, Baldwin maintained close friendships and political alliances throughout his reign. He never married, partly because of his illness, but also because of the political complications such a union would have created. Yet he took careful steps to ensure the succession and the kingdom's future stability. Baldwin's death in 1185 at the age of 24 marked the end of one of the most remarkable reigns in medieval history. His passing was mourned not just in Jerusalem but throughout the Christian world, where his courage and achievements had become legendary. The fact that he had survived and thrived for more than a decade, with a condition that typically killed within years, was seen as evidence of divine favor and personal sanctity. The medical mystery of Baldwin IV reminds us that historical figures often faced challenges that we can barely imagine, and that human resilience and adaptability can triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. His story illustrates the complex relationship between physical condition and political capability, showing how personal adversity can sometimes become a source of strength rather than weakness. Baldwin's reign also demonstrates the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating historical figures. The leper king who emerged from medieval chronicles as a figure of pathos and inspiration proves, upon closer examination, to have been a sophisticated political leader whose achievements were made more remarkable rather than less impressive by the personal challenges he faced. The mystery of his exact medical condition may never be fully resolved, but the legacy of his courage, intelligence, and determination continues to inspire those who study the medieval period. Baldwin IV represents the triumph of human will over physical limitation, a reminder that the most extraordinary historical achievements often emerge from the most difficult circumstances. From the royal courts of Jerusalem, let our thoughts drift to a very different kind of medieval institution, the quiet cloisters of European convents, where women sought spiritual fulfillment through lives of prayer, contemplation, and service. Yet even in these sacred spaces, human nature sometimes asserted itself in ways that challenged the ideals of monastic life, creating mysteries that would remain hidden for centuries until modern science provided new ways of understanding the past. In a European convent cemetery, archaeologists conducting a routine excavation expected to find the typical remains of medieval religious life, nuns buried in simple shrouds, perhaps accompanied by rosary beads or other religious artifacts that would speak to lives dedicated to spiritual devotion. Instead, they discovered something that challenged assumptions about medieval religious communities and forced historians to confront the gap between religious ideals and human reality. The skeleton they unearthed was clearly that of a woman who had lived and died as a nun, buried in the religious habit that marked her dedication to the monastic life, but nestled against her ribs, in a position that suggested they had been buried together intentionally, were the remains of a newborn infant. The discovery presented a puzzle that touched on some of the most sensitive aspects of medieval religious and social history. For centuries, historians had been aware that medieval monasteries and convents sometimes struggled with the same human frailties that affected secular society. Chronicles and official records contained occasional references to disciplinary proceedings against religious men and women who had violated their vows of celibacy. But such cases were typically handled discreetly within the religious community and rarely left detailed records for posterity. The physical evidence of a nun buried with an infant represented something different from the usual documentary evidence of monastic scandal. Here was undeniable proof that at least one member of a religious community had not only violated her vow of chastity, but had carried a pregnancy to term and given birth, presumably within the walls of the convent itself. The discovery raised immediate questions about the circumstances surrounding both the pregnancy and the death. Had the nun been the victim of sexual assault, either by someone from outside the religious community or by a member of the clergy who had access to the convent? Had she engaged in a consensual relationship, perhaps with a priest or with someone she had known before taking religious vows? Had she died in childbirth, or had both mother and child succumbed to some other cause? Modern DNA analysis provided definitive answers to at least some of these questions. Genetic testing confirmed that the infant was indeed biologically related to the woman, eliminating any possibility that she had been caring for someone else's child, or that the burial association was coincidental. The nun had given birth to this child, violating one of the most fundamental vows of religious life. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond the personal tragedy of one medieval woman. Medieval convents were supposed to be spaces of spiritual purity, communities where women could dedicate themselves entirely to religious devotion, without the distractions and complications of secular life. The presence of a child within such a community represented not just a personal failing, but a challenge to the entire institutional structure of medieval religious life. Yet the manner of the burial suggests that the religious community handled this scandal with a degree of compassion and discretion that reveals the complex human dynamics within medieval monasteries. The nun was not buried in unconsecrated ground or without religious rites, as might have been expected for someone who had so dramatically violated her vows. Instead, she was interred within the convent cemetery, in holy ground, with her religious habit intact. This burial treatment suggests that the community chose to emphasize forgiveness and Christian charity over punishment and condemnation. The decision to bury mother and child together indicates that the infant was not seen as a shameful secret to be hidden or disposed of, but as a human being deserving of Christian burial and eternal rest alongside its mother. The discretion shown in this burial also reflects the practical considerations that governed medieval religious communities. Scandals involving sexual impropriety could have devastating consequences for monasteries and convents, potentially leading to loss of patronage, interference from church authorities, or even dissolution of the community. By handling the situation quietly and internally, the nuns may have been protecting not just the reputation of their deceased sister, but the survival of their entire community. The medical evidence from the skeleton provides additional insights into the circumstances of the deaths. Analysis of the woman's pelvic bones shows evidence of the physical trauma associated with childbirth, suggesting that she may have died in labor or from complications following delivery. Medieval obstetrics was primitive and dangerous, and death in childbirth was common even among women who had access to the best available medical care. The infant's remains show no signs of injury or deliberate harm, indicating that the child most likely died from natural causes related to the difficulties of birth or early infancy, in an age when infant mortality was extremely high. The fact that both mother and child were buried together suggests that they died within a short time of each other, possibly during or immediately after the birth process. The identity of the child's father remains unknown and knowable, lost to the passage of centuries, and the discretion of those who buried the secret with mother and child. The possibilities range from the tragic to the criminal: a consensual relationship that violated religious vows, a sexual assault that compounded personal tragedy with institutional crisis, or perhaps a relationship that had begun before the woman entered religious life and continued despite her monastic vows. Medieval records contain enough references to similar cases to suggest that the nun's situation, while certainly scandalous, was not entirely unprecedented. Religious communities across Europe occasionally dealt with pregnancies among their members, developing informal protocols for handling such situations that balance the need for discipline with considerations of charity and discretion. The discovery of this medieval nun and her child illustrates the complex relationship between religious ideals and human reality in medieval society. While monastic communities aspired to create spaces of spiritual perfection, they remained populated by human beings subject to the same desires, weaknesses, and tragedies that affected secular society. The compassionate burial of both mother and child suggests that medieval religious communities, whatever their official teachings about sin and punishment, often found ways to respond to human frailty with understanding and mercy. The decision to maintain the nun's dignity in death, to bury her in consecrated ground with her religious habit intact, speaks to a practical Christianity that valued forgiveness over condemnation. This medieval mystery reminds us that the past was inhabited by real people facing real dilemmas, that often defied the simple moral categories that historical narratives sometimes impose. The nun who violated her vows may have been a sinner by the standards of her time, but she was also a human being who faced impossible choices and paid the ultimate price for her humanity. The silence that surrounded her burial for centuries reflects not just the shame associated with her actions, but also the protective discretion of a community that chose to handle tragedy with quiet dignity, rather than public condemnation. In death, she found the peace and acceptance that may have eluded her in the final months of her life. From the compassionate secrecy of medieval religious communities, let us turn our attention to a very different kind of mystery, one that involves the deliberate and dramatic alteration of human appearance for aesthetic and cultural purposes. In a medieval European grave, archaeologists discovered a skull so unusually shaped that it immediately sparked speculation about everything from ancient aliens to genetic mutations. Yet the true explanation proved to be both more mundane and more fascinating than the supernatural theories would suggest. The skull in question displayed extreme elongation, with the cranium stretched upward and backward in a manner that created a profile unlike anything in normal human anatomy. The forehead sloped dramatically, the back of the head extended far beyond typical proportions, and the overall shape suggested either a severe developmental abnormality or some form of deliberate modification that had occurred during the individual's lifetime. Initial examination of the remains revealed that this was the skull of a woman, probably of high social status based on the grave goods and burial context that accompanied her interment. The extreme nature of the cranial deformation immediately attracted attention from researchers and enthusiasts who were fascinated by anomalous archaeological discoveries and eager to propose exotic explanations for unusual finds. The skull's unusual appearance naturally invited speculation about extraterrestrial visitors, genetic experiments, or lost civilizations with advanced medical knowledge. Popular media and internet forums buzzed with theories about ancient alien contact, prehistoric advanced technologies, or evidence of non-human intelligence that had somehow influenced early human development. However, careful archaeological and anthropological analysis revealed a much more earthbound but equally fascinating explanation for the skull's unusual shape. The extreme elongation was not the result of genetic abnormality or extraterrestrial intervention, but of a deliberate cultural practice known as artificial cranial modification or intentional head shaping. This practice, which was widespread in various cultures throughout human history, involved the systematic application of pressure to infant skulls during the critical early months of life, when the bones were still soft and malleable. By binding the head with cloth wrappings, wooden boards, or specially designed cradle systems, parents could gradually reshape their children's skulls to conform to cultural ideals of beauty, status, or spiritual significance. The process of cranial modification required careful attention and consistent pressure over many months. Infant skulls were bound soon after birth, with the binding materials adjusted regularly as the child grew to maintain the desired pressure and direction of shaping. The technique was most effective during the first year of life, when rapid brain growth created internal pressure that could be channeled and directed by external constraints. Different cultures developed distinct styles of cranial modification that reflected their particular aesthetic preferences and social values. Some groups favored dramatic backward elongation of the skull, creating profiles that emphasized the vertical dimension of the head. Others preferred lateral compression that made the skull narrower but taller, while still others sought to create flattened foreheads or pointed craniums that served as markers of social identity. The practice of intentional head shaping was found among cultures across the globe, from the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, from nomadic tribes of Central Asia to settled agricultural communities in Europe. This widespread distribution suggests that cranial modification represented a fundamental human impulse to use the body as a canvas for cultural expression and social communication. In the context of medieval Europe, cranial modification was particularly associated with nomadic peoples and migrating tribes who had contact with cultures where such practices were traditional. The Huns who invaded Europe during the 4th and 5th centuries were known to practice head shaping as a marker of ethnic identity and social status within their communities. The woman whose skull was discovered in the medieval European grave most likely belonged to one of these nomadic groups, or was descended from people who had maintained traditional practices even after settling in European territories. Her dramatically modified skull would have served as a permanent marker of her cultural identity, a visible sign of her connection to traditions and communities that predated her settlement in medieval European society. The social implications of cranial modification in medieval Europe were complex and multifaceted. On one hand, such dramatic physical alteration would have made individuals immediately recognizable as members of specific ethnic or cultural groups, potentially subjecting them to discrimination or suspicion from settled European populations who viewed nomadic peoples with distrust. On the other hand, the elaborate nature of cranial modification suggested high social status within the individual's own community. The time, effort, and resources required to carry out successful head shaping indicated that the child's family had both the knowledge to perform the procedure correctly and the social position that made such investment worthwhile. The aesthetic ideals that motivated cranial modification often connected physical appearance to spiritual or supernatural concepts. Elongated skulls might represent attempts to make individuals resemble gods or spiritual beings, to create physical forms that suggested connection to otherworldly powers, or to embody cultural concepts of beauty and perfection that differed dramatically from modern European standards. The discovery of modified skulls in medieval European contexts also illuminates the complexity of population movements and cultural exchange during the medieval period. Rather than representing isolated instances of individual abnormality, such finds suggest ongoing contact between settled European communities and migrating peoples who maintained distinct cultural traditions even as they integrated into new social environments. The persistence of cranial modification practices into the medieval period demonstrates the strength of cultural traditions and the ways that communities could maintain distinct identities, even when living among populations with very different customs and beliefs. The woman with the elongated skull represented not just an individual choice, but a community commitment to preserving practices that connected present generations to ancestral traditions. Modern analysis of artificially modified skulls has revealed that the procedure, while dramatic in its effects, did not typically cause significant health problems or cognitive impairment. The human brain is remarkably adaptable and can function normally even when contained within dramatically reshaped craniums. Children who underwent cranial modification generally developed normally and lived full lives within their communities. The mystery of the elongated skull reminds us that human cultures have always found ways to use the body as a medium for artistic expression, social communication, and cultural identity. What might seem bizarre or impossible to modern observers often represented sophisticated cultural practices that served important social functions within their original contexts. The transformation of this archaeological mystery from potential evidence of alien contact into documentation of human cultural diversity illustrates the importance of approaching unusual discoveries with both open minds and rigorous analytical methods. The truth about the past is often stranger and more interesting than the fantasies we might construct, but it requires careful investigation to separate genuine historical phenomena from wishful thinking or sensational speculation. As we move away from the deliberately modified skulls of nomadic peoples, let us wade into the waters of medieval mystery, where the discovery of ancient weapons in lakes and rivers has sparked both archaeological excitement and popular fascination with legendary tales of magical swords and divine interventions. Across the British Isles and much of medieval Europe, lakes, rivers, and wetlands have yielded remarkable collections of medieval weapons, particularly swords that have been preserved in anaerobic underwater environments for centuries. These discoveries have captured public imagination, partly because they seem to echo the Arthurian legend of Excalibur, the magical sword that was returned to the Lady of the Lake, but also because they raise fascinating questions about medieval warfare, religious practices, and the symbolic significance of weapons in medieval culture. The most recent and dramatic of these discoveries occurred when a young person exploring the shores of a Swedish lake noticed something unusual protruding from the shallow water near the bank. What emerged from the muddy lake bed was a remarkably well-preserved medieval sword, its blade still intact despite having spent centuries submerged in the acidic waters that had protected it from the oxidation that destroys most iron artifacts. Initial examination revealed that the sword dated from approximately the 9th to 11th centuries, placing it firmly within the medieval period, when such weapons represented not just military tools, but significant investments of time, skill, and resources. Medieval swords were expensive items that required considerable expertise to manufacture, and they often served as symbols of social status, family heritage, and personal honor, as much as practical implements of warfare. The discovery immediately raised questions about how and why such a valuable object had ended up in the lake. In a society where iron was precious and skilled metalworking was expensive, The loss or abandonment of a sword represented a significant economic sacrifice that would not have been undertaken lightly. The weapon's presence in the water suggested either accidental loss, deliberate disposal, or some form of ritual deposition that connected to religious or cultural practices. Archaeological investigation of the discovery site and analysis of the sword itself began to provide clues about the circumstances that had led to its deposition in the lake. The weapon showed no signs of battle damage or deliberate destruction, suggesting that it had not been discarded because it was broken or unusable. Instead, it appeared to have been placed in the water while still in functional condition, raising questions about the motivations behind such an action. One possibility involved ritual deposition, a practice that was widespread in pre-Christian and early medieval European cultures. Archaeological evidence from across Europe documents the deliberate offering of valuable objects, including weapons, to lakes, rivers, and bog deposits as part of religious ceremonies or spiritual practices that sought to honor gods, ensure good fortune, or mark important transitions in individual or community life. The practice of weapon deposition in water had ancient roots in Celtic and Germanic traditions that viewed lakes and rivers as sacred spaces, gateways to otherworldly realms where offerings could reach supernatural powers that controlled human fate. By sacrificing valuable objects to these watery deities, medieval peoples sought to ensure protection in battle, success in important endeavors, or favorable resolution of conflicts and disputes. Medieval Christianity officially discouraged such practices as pagan superstitions, but archaeological evidence suggests that Christianized populations continued to engage in ritual deposition well into the medieval period, sometimes incorporating Christian symbolism into traditional practices or finding theological justifications for offerings that connected to older spiritual traditions. The sword discovered in the Swedish lake might thus represent evidence of syncretic religious practices that combined Christian and pre-Christian elements, reflecting the complex process by which medieval European populations adapted to new religious frameworks, while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions that provided psychological comfort and cultural continuity. Alternative explanations for the sword's presence in the lake focus on more practical considerations related to medieval warfare and social conflict. Medieval battles often took place near water sources, as armies required access to fresh water for both men and horses. Weapons lost during combat could easily end up in lakes or rivers, particularly if fighting took place on marshy ground or if retreating forces had to cross water barriers while under pressure from pursuing enemies. The sword might also have been deliberately discarded by someone fleeing from battle or attempting to avoid capture after military defeat. In medieval warfare, possession of weapons could mark individuals as combatants subject to execution or harsh treatment, so throwing away arms might represent a survival strategy adopted by soldiers attempting to blend in with civilian populations. Personal conflicts and legal disputes provided another context in which valuable weapons might be deliberately disposed of in water. Medieval legal systems sometimes required the destruction or removal of weapons used in crimes, and throwing a sword into a lake might represent compliance with legal judgments or attempts to remove evidence of violent acts that could lead to prosecution or blood feuds. The practice of hiding valuable objects in water might also reflect the unstable political conditions that characterized much of medieval Europe, where warfare, raiding, and political upheaval created frequent threats to personal property. Burying or submerging valuable items provided a way of protecting wealth during dangerous periods, though the failure to retrieve such objects suggests that their owners may not have survived the conflicts that prompted concealment. Environmental factors also played a role in weapon deposition, as the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions found in many European lakes and bogs created ideal environments for preserving iron objects that would have corroded completely if left exposed to air and moisture. The same conditions that made these waters effective for ritual purposes also made them excellent accidental archives that have preserved evidence of medieval material culture. The symbolic significance of swords in medieval culture adds another layer of meaning to discoveries of weapons in aquatic contexts. Medieval literature is filled with references to magical or legendary swords associated with water, from Excalibur to the various enchanted weapons that appear in Norse sagas and Germanic epics. These literary traditions suggest that the connection between swords and water held deep cultural significance that transcended practical considerations. The discovery of medieval swords in lakes and rivers illustrates the complex relationship between material culture, religious practice, and social identity in medieval society. Whether deposited for ritual reasons, lost in battle, or hidden during times of crisis, These weapons represent individual stories of medieval life that have been preserved by the same watery environments that medieval peoples viewed as gateways to supernatural realms. The ongoing discovery of such weapons reminds us that medieval Europe was a world where the sacred and secular, the practical and symbolic, were intimately connected in ways that shaped how people understood their relationships with both the natural world and the supernatural forces they believed controlled human destiny. From the watery graves of medieval swords, let our thoughts drift toward the mysterious stone circles that dot the English countryside, ancient monuments whose origins predate the medieval period by millennia, yet which accumulated legends and folklore throughout the medieval era that reflected contemporary anxieties about paganism, witchcraft, and the supernatural powers that might reside in ancient stones. The Whispering Knights, a group of standing stones in Oxfordshire, represent one of the most evocatively named megalithic monuments in Britain, their title suggesting both the anthropomorphic qualities that medieval people attributed to ancient stones and the acoustic properties that may have contributed to their mysterious reputation. These stones, like many other prehistoric monuments, became focal points for medieval folklore that attempted to explain their origins and purpose through narratives that reflected contemporary religious and social concerns. The 5 stones that comprise the Whispering Knights stand in a rough circle, leaning inward toward each other, in a configuration that immediately suggests conspiratorial conversation to the imaginative observer. Medieval folklore seized upon this apparent grouping to create stories that explained the stones as the petrified remains of knights who had been transformed by divine punishment for plotting against legitimate authority. According to local legend, the Whispering Knights were once human conspirators who had gathered to plan the overthrow of a king or the betrayal of their sworn lord. Their treasonous plotting was discovered by supernatural forces that punished their disloyalty by transforming them into stone, freezing them forever in the act of whispering their seditious plans to each other. This legendary explanation reflects medieval anxieties about political loyalty and the consequences of rebellion against established authority. The transformation of the knights into stone represented divine justice, the idea that supernatural powers actively intervened in human affairs to punish those who violated their oaths of fealty or threatened the social order that medieval society viewed as divinely ordained. The folklore surrounding the Whispering Knights also incorporated beliefs about the continuing supernatural activity of the petrified figures. Local traditions held that the stones could still be heard whispering to each other on certain nights, particularly when the moon was full, or during times of political upheaval, when their ancient concerns about conspiracy and rebellion became relevant to contemporary events. These auditory phenomena, which contributed to the stone's reputation for supernatural activity, can now be understood through acoustic analysis that reveals the unusual sound properties created by the stone's positioning and composition. The arrangement of the megaliths creates localized echo chambers and sound reflection patterns that can cause whispers or quiet conversations to carry in unexpected ways, making it seem as if voices are emanating from the stones themselves. Sound behaves strangely around megalithic monuments, for several reasons related to their construction and positioning. The large mass of stone can reflect and focus sound waves in ways that create acoustic effects, ranging from enhanced echo to the apparent displacement of sound sources. When combined with the psychological expectations created by folklore about whispering stones, these acoustic properties could easily generate experiences that seem to confirm supernatural beliefs. The acoustic effects of the Whispering Knights may have been intentionally incorporated into the monument's design by its Neolithic builders, who possessed sophisticated understanding of sound and its manipulation. Many prehistoric monuments show evidence of deliberate acoustic engineering, with chambers and passages designed to amplify, focus, or alter sounds in ways that enhance their ritual or ceremonial functions. Modern archaeological analysis has revealed that the Whispering Knights are actually the remains of a Neolithic burial chamber, constructed approximately 5,000 years ago as part of a larger complex of prehistoric monuments in the Rollright area. The stones that medieval folklore interpreted as conspiratorial knights were originally the structural elements of a communal tomb, upright stones that supported covering slabs to create a protected space for the interment of multiple individuals. The original function of the monument, as a burial chamber, adds another layer of meaning to the medieval legends about whispering stones. If local populations retained any folk memory of the site's connection to the dead, this could have contributed to beliefs about supernatural voices emanating from the stones, as the whispers of ancient spirits were thought to continue communicating across the boundaries between life and death. The transformation of a Neolithic burial chamber into a medieval tale of political conspiracy illustrates the process by which later cultures reinterpreted ancient monuments according to their own concerns and conceptual frameworks. Medieval society, preoccupied with issues of political loyalty and divine justice, naturally created explanations for mysterious stone circles that reflected these contemporary anxieties. The persistence of folklore about the Whispering Knights demonstrates the continuing power of ancient monuments to capture human imagination and generate narratives that attempt to explain the unexplainable. Even when the original purpose and meaning of prehistoric sites had been completely forgotten, their physical presence continued to demand explanation and integration into contemporary belief systems. The acoustic properties that contributed to the stone's reputation for supernatural whispering also remind us that ancient monument builders possessed sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that modern scientific analysis is only beginning to appreciate fully. The deliberate manipulation of sound, light, and spatial relationships in prehistoric monuments suggests that their creators were skilled engineers who understood how to use natural properties to create powerful psychological and spiritual experiences. The study of sites like the Whispering Knights illustrates the complex relationship between physical environment, cultural interpretation, and historical continuity that characterizes the interaction between different periods of human occupation in the same landscape. Ancient monuments continue to influence the communities that live around them, generating stories and beliefs that reflect the ongoing human need to understand and connect with the mysterious aspects of the past. The Whispering Knights remind us that history is not just about documented events and identifiable individuals, but also about the ways that different generations have understood and interpreted the physical remains of their predecessors. The medieval folklore that grew up around these stones is as much a part of their historical significance as their original Neolithic function, representing layers of human meaning that have accumulated over thousands of years. From the whispered secrets of ancient stones, let us turn our attention to a different kind of mystery that emerged from medieval burial practices and the complex relationship between death, decay, and spiritual significance in Christian Europe. Throughout the medieval period, stories circulated about holy individuals whose bodies refused to follow the normal processes of decomposition after death, creating both wonder and anxiety among communities that struggled to understand these apparent departures from natural law. The phenomenon of incorrupt bodies held special significance in medieval Christian culture, where the condition of human remains after death was interpreted as evidence of spiritual status and divine favor. Saints and holy individuals were expected to demonstrate their sanctity through miraculous preservation of their earthly forms, while sinners and the spiritually corrupt were thought to decay rapidly or suffer unusual forms of bodily corruption that reflected their moral failings. In a small monastery in Eastern Europe, the death of a nun who had lived an apparently unremarkable life of quiet devotion created just such a mystery when her body was discovered to be perfectly preserved months after her burial. The sister had been interred during the harsh winter months, following standard monastic practices for the care of deceased community members, but when circumstances required the relocation of her remains, the discovery of her incorrupt state sparked immediate speculation about her hidden sanctity. Contemporary accounts describe the profound impact of this discovery on the monastic community and the surrounding region. The nun's body showed no signs of the decay that would normally be expected after months of burial. Her skin remained intact and naturally colored, her features were peaceful and recognizable, and there was no odor of corruption that typically accompanied exhumed remains. Word of the miraculous preservation spread quickly beyond the monastery walls, attracting pilgrims and curiosity seekers who hoped to witness evidence of divine intervention in the natural world. The monastery found itself at the center of a popular devotional movement that threatened to disrupt the quiet contemplative life that the community valued, as crowds gathered to venerate the preserved remains of the previously unknown sister. Church authorities faced a delicate situation that required careful investigation of both the physical facts of the preservation and the spiritual implications of the phenomenon. Medieval canon law provided procedures for evaluating claims of sanctity and miraculous events, but these processes were complex and politically sensitive, involving questions of local versus universal authority and the proper relationship between popular devotion and official church doctrine. The preserved body was subjected to examination by church officials, physicians, and other learned individuals who attempted to determine whether the lack of decay represented genuine supernatural intervention or could be explained through natural causes. Medieval medical knowledge provided limited understanding of the factors that influenced bodily decomposition, but observers were aware that environmental conditions could affect the rate and extent of decay in buried remains. Modern scientific understanding of the preservation process reveals that the nun's incorrupt state was almost certainly the result of natural mummification rather than supernatural intervention. Under specific environmental conditions, human remains can undergo chemical changes that effectively prevent normal bacterial decomposition and result in remarkably well-preserved bodies that can remain intact for extended periods. The key factors in natural mummification include temperature, humidity, air circulation, soil chemistry, and the presence or absence of bacteria and other microorganisms that typically cause bodily decay. Cold, dry conditions can effectively halt decomposition by preventing bacterial growth, while certain soil compositions can create chemical environments that preserve organic materials through processes similar to those used in artificial mummification. The monastery where the nun was buried provided ideal conditions for natural preservation through several environmental factors that were common in medieval religious architecture. Stone crypts and burial chambers typically maintained consistent cool temperatures throughout the year, while their construction materials could absorb moisture and create relatively dry environments that inhibited bacterial activity. The timing of the nun's death during winter months would have provided additional preservation benefits, as cold temperatures would have slowed initial decomposition processes and allowed chemical changes to begin that could result in long-term preservation. The combination of cold burial conditions and the specific environmental characteristics of the monastery's burial site created circumstances that were conducive to natural mummification. Analysis of the nun's preserved remains and the burial environment revealed evidence of the specific preservation processes that had occurred. The body had undergone saponification, a chemical transformation in which body fats convert to a waxy, soap-like substance that resists bacterial decomposition and can preserve soft tissues for extended periods under appropriate conditions. This natural preservation process, while scientifically explainable, does not diminish the cultural and spiritual significance that the incorrupt body held for medieval communities. The nun's preservation served important social and religious functions regardless of its supernatural or natural origins, providing a focal point for communal devotion and a tangible connection to beliefs about sanctity, divine favor, and the relationship between physical and spiritual states. The investigation of medieval preserved bodies also reveals important information about medieval diet, health, and living conditions that can enhance our understanding of monastic life and medieval society more generally. Analysis of preserved remains can provide evidence about nutrition, disease, environmental stresses, and other factors that influence the daily lives of medieval religious communities. The nun's preserved body, when subjected to modern scientific analysis, revealed a diet that consisted primarily of simple grains, vegetables, and preserved fish, reflecting the austere nutritional practices of medieval monasticism. The absence of evidence for infectious diseases or nutritional deficiencies suggested that she had lived in a relatively healthy environment, despite the limitations of medieval medical knowledge. The mystery of medieval preserved bodies illustrates the complex relationship between natural phenomena, religious interpretation, and social meaning in medieval culture. Communities that encountered such preservation naturally sought explanations that were consistent with their understanding of divine intervention and spiritual significance, creating narratives that served important cultural functions even when they did not accurately reflect the underlying physical processes. The study of naturally preserved medieval remains continues to provide valuable insights into medieval life, death, and the environmental conditions that shaped human experience during this period. These accidental archives of medieval life preserve not just physical evidence but also cultural attitudes toward death, sanctity, and the supernatural that help us understand how medieval communities made sense of mysterious phenomena. The transformation of our understanding of preserved medieval bodies from evidence of supernatural intervention to examples of natural preservation processes reflects the broader evolution of scientific knowledge and analytical techniques that allow modern researchers to address historical questions with greater precision and accuracy than was available to medieval investigators. As we move from the mysteries of medieval burial grounds toward the systematized investigation of crime that emerged in the Victorian era, we witness a fundamental transformation in how society approached the challenge of understanding human behavior, identifying wrongdoers, and maintaining social order through the application of rational investigation rather than superstition or arbitrary authority. The birth of modern detective work in Victorian England represented a revolution in the relationship between law enforcement and society, transforming crime solving from a haphazard collection of traditional practices into a professional discipline that combined careful observation, systematic methodology, and emerging scientific techniques. This transformation reflected broader Victorian confidence in the power of rational inquiry to solve complex problems and improve human society through the application of knowledge and method. When people think of Victorian crime solving, the image that often comes to mind is that of a detective in a deerstalker hat and cape, magnifying glass in hand, prowling the fog-shrouded streets of London in pursuit of malefactors who threatened the stability of respectable society. While this romanticized vision owes more to literature than to historical reality, it captures something important about the Victorian belief that crime could be understood, analyzed, and ultimately defeated through the application of superior intellect and systematic investigation. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829 by Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, represented the first systematic attempt to create professional law enforcement based on principles of organization, training, and accountability, rather than the traditional reliance on amateur constables, night watchmen, and military intervention. The new police force was designed to prevent crime through visible presence and rapid response rather than simply reacting to criminal acts after they had been committed. However, it quickly became apparent that uniformed patrol officers, while effective at maintaining public order and deterring opportunistic crime, were inadequate for addressing the more sophisticated criminal activities that flourished in the rapidly growing industrial cities of Victorian England. The anonymous urban environment provided opportunities for criminal enterprises that required detective skills, long-term investigation, and specialized knowledge to identify and apprehend. In 1842, a small detective branch was created within the Metropolitan Police, consisting of just 8 plainclothes officers who were tasked with investigating crimes that could not be solved through conventional policing methods. These early detectives faced immediate suspicion from both the public and their uniformed colleagues, who viewed their methods as somehow un-English and contrary to the principles of open, honest law enforcement. The Victorian public harbored deep ambivalence about detective work, recognizing its necessity while remaining uncomfortable with the methods it required. Detectives operated in disguise, infiltrated criminal organizations, and used deception and surveillance techniques that seemed to blur the line between lawful investigation and the criminal behavior they were supposed to combat. This uneasiness reflected broader Victorian anxieties about privacy, respectability, and the proper limits of state authority. Despite these concerns, public fascination with detective work grew throughout the Victorian period, fueled by sensational newspaper coverage of major criminal investigations and the emergence of detective fiction as a popular literary genre. The apparent ability of skilled investigators to solve seemingly impossible crimes through careful observation and logical deduction captured the Victorian imagination and reinforced contemporary faith in the power of scientific rationality. The early Victorian detectives had to prove their worth through success in high-profile cases that demonstrated the value of professional investigation over traditional methods of crime solving. They pursued master thieves who specialized in sophisticated techniques such as safe-cracking and art theft, tracked down elaborate confidence schemes that preyed on the gullible through complex deceptions, and investigated political conspiracies during a period when revolutionary movements threatened established authority across Europe. These investigations required skills that went far beyond the capabilities of ordinary police constables. Detectives needed to understand criminal psychology, recognize patterns of behavior that connected seemingly unrelated crimes, and develop networks of informants who could provide information about criminal activities. They had to master techniques of surveillance, interrogation, and evidence collection that were still being developed through trial and error. The transformation of detective work from an experimental innovation into an accepted part of law enforcement reflected the broader Victorian embrace of professional expertise and scientific methodology. By the 1860s and 1870s, Scotland Yard detectives were appearing in courtrooms with evidence that carried more weight than traditional forms of testimony, based on personal observation or community reputation. The reputation of Victorian detective work was cemented by high-profile cases that captured public attention and demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic investigation. The pursuit of notorious criminals such as the Ratcliffe Highway murderers, who terrorized London with brutal killings, or the investigation of elaborate fraud schemes that threatened the financial security of respectable citizens, showed that detective work could address crimes that had previously seemed unsolvable. Perhaps most importantly, Victorian detective work established the principle that criminal investigation should be based on evidence rather than suspicion, confession, or social prejudice. While Victorian detectives were far from perfect in their application of these principles, and certainly carried their own biases and limitations, they began the process of transforming law enforcement from an expression of authority into a search for truth. The cultural impact of Victorian detective work extended far beyond law enforcement itself, influencing literature, journalism, and popular understanding of crime and justice. Detective fiction, beginning with works such as Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and reaching its pinnacle with Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, created a mythology around detective work that emphasized the triumph of reason over chaos, intelligence over brute force. This literary tradition both reflected and shaped public expectations about what detective work could accomplish, creating pressure on real investigators to live up to fictional standards of brilliance and infallibility, while also generating public support for the expansion of professional detective capabilities. The popularity of detective fiction helped legitimize methods and techniques that might otherwise have been viewed with suspicion or hostility. Victorian detective work also established many of the fundamental principles and practices that continue to characterize criminal investigation today. The emphasis on careful observation, systematic collection and analysis of evidence, understanding of criminal behavior patterns, and coordination between different investigative agencies all emerged during this formative period in the development of professional law enforcement. From the establishment of professional detective work, let us turn our attention to one of the most significant developments in Victorian crime solving, the emergence of forensic autopsy as a systematic method for determining the causes of death and gathering evidence about criminal activities. This transformation of medical examination of the dead from a perfunctory ritual into a rigorous scientific investigation represented a fundamental shift in how society approached questions of mortality, responsibility, and justice. In early Victorian England, investigations into suspicious deaths were often cursory affairs conducted by coroners who possessed minimal medical training and operated according to traditional procedures that emphasized community judgment over scientific analysis. A typical death investigation might involve a brief visual examination of the body, collection of testimony from witnesses or family members, and a verdict that satisfied social expectations rather than medical accuracy. This traditional approach proved increasingly inadequate, as Victorian society became more complex and criminal activities more sophisticated. The anonymous urban environment made it easier for murderers to escape detection, while new poisons and more subtle methods of killing required specialized knowledge to identify and investigate. The limitations of traditional death investigation became apparent in cases where obvious signs of violence were absent, but suspicious circumstances suggested criminal activity. The revolution in death investigation began when physicians started to approach corpses not as mere shells of the deceased, but as repositories of evidence that could provide detailed information about the circumstances of death. This shift required doctors to develop new skills in observation, analysis, and interpretation that went far beyond the medical training typically provided to Victorian physicians. The systematic examination of internal organs, analysis of stomach contents for evidence of poisoning, careful documentation of wounds and injuries, and correlation of physical evidence with witness testimony transformed the autopsy from a ritual confirmation of death into a scientific investigation that could reveal information invisible to casual observation. These techniques were not just grisly procedures, but the foundations of a new science that could speak for the dead in ways that had never before been possible. Toxicology emerged as one of the most important subspecialties within forensic medicine, reflecting Victorian anxieties about poison as the preferred weapon of domestic murderers. Arsenic, mercury, strychnine, and other toxic substances were readily available for legitimate purposes, but could be used by calculating killers who hoped to disguise murder as natural death or accident. The development of reliable chemical tests for detecting poisons in human remains revolutionized criminal investigation by providing objective evidence that could not be disputed or explained away through alternative theories. For the first time in history, prosecutors could prove definitively that someone had been poisoned, eliminating the uncertainty that had previously allowed many poisoners to escape justice. The Marsh test for arsenic, developed in 1836, became the first widely used forensic toxicology procedure and established the template for subsequent advances in poison detection. This test could identify minute quantities of arsenic in bodily tissues or fluids, providing evidence that remained stable and convincing even months or years after death. The dramatic courtroom demonstrations of chemical testing created powerful theater that impressed juries and reinforced public confidence in scientific investigation. Other advances in forensic toxicology followed rapidly, as chemists developed techniques for detecting strychnine, cyanide, opium derivatives, and various plant-based poisons. Each new test expanded the range of criminal activities that could be investigated scientifically and reduced the opportunities for poisoners to escape detection through the use of exotic or unfamiliar substances. The public fascination with forensic toxicology reflected broader Victorian anxieties about the safety of domestic life and the possibility that familiar foods, medicines, or household products might be turned into instruments of murder. The idea that a cup of tea or a dose of patent medicine might contain fatal poison captured the imagination of a society that was simultaneously embracing new technologies and fearing their potential for misuse. However, the development of forensic autopsy techniques was not without controversy and resistance. Many Victorians remained deeply uncomfortable with the dissection of human bodies, viewing such procedures as violations of religious principle or natural decency. The idea that scientific investigation required the systematic dismemberment of corpses conflicted with traditional beliefs about the sanctity of the human form and the proper treatment of the dead. Religious objections to autopsy were reinforced by superstitious fears about the consequences of disturbing the dead and concerns about the impact of dissection on prospects for resurrection and eternal life. These anxieties were particularly acute when autopsies were performed on respectable individuals whose families had not consented to such procedures and who had expected their deceased relatives to be treated with conventional dignity. Legal challenges to forensic autopsy focused on questions of authority and consent, as families and communities struggled to understand who had the right to order invasive examinations of the dead and under what circumstances such procedures could be justified. The tension between public interest in criminal investigation and private rights of the deceased and their survivors created ongoing conflicts that required careful negotiation and legal clarification. Despite these obstacles, forensic autopsy gradually gained acceptance as its value in solving crimes and protecting public safety became apparent. High-profile cases where autopsy evidence led to the conviction of previously undetectable murderers demonstrated that scientific investigation could serve justice in ways that traditional methods could not match. The transformation of death investigation also required changes in medical education and professional training to prepare physicians for forensic work. Medical schools began to include instruction in toxicology, pathology, and legal medicine, while experienced forensic practitioners developed specialized knowledge that distinguished them from ordinary doctors. The emergence of expert medical testimony in criminal trials created new roles for physicians and new challenges for legal systems that had to learn how to evaluate and present scientific evidence. The courtroom became a theater where complex medical concepts had to be explained to juries composed of ordinary citizens who possessed no specialized knowledge but whose judgments would determine questions of life and death. The Victorian Revolution in forensic autopsy established principles and practices that continue to influence modern death investigation, while also creating new forms of professional expertise that expanded the role of medical knowledge in legal proceedings. The systematic examination of the dead became one of the most powerful tools available to criminal investigators, providing evidence that could not lie, forget, or be intimidated into silence. The development of forensic autopsy techniques also contributed to broader advances in medical knowledge by encouraging systematic observation and documentation of pathological conditions, disease processes, and the effects of various toxic substances on human physiology. The intersection of criminal investigation and medical research created opportunities for scientific discovery that benefited both law enforcement and public health. From the scientific examination of the dead, let us turn our attention to the systematic identification of the living, through one of the most revolutionary developments in Victorian crime solving, the introduction of fingerprinting as a method for establishing individual identity with unprecedented accuracy and reliability. This innovation transformed law enforcement by providing the first truly scientific method for connecting suspects to crimes based on physical evidence that could not be altered, disguised, or disputed. Throughout most of human history, the identification of individuals for legal purposes had relied on personal recognition, physical description, or documentation that could easily be forged or transferred between people. Criminal suspects could escape prosecution simply by changing their appearance, adopting false names, or moving to communities where they were not known. The anonymous urban environment of industrial cities made such escape increasingly easy and common. The problem of identification was particularly acute in cases involving repeat offenders, whose previous criminal records could provide important context for sentencing decisions, but who could only be connected to past crimes through the uncertain process of personal recognition by witnesses, victims, or police officers. The limitations of human memory and the possibilities for deliberate deception made such identifications unreliable and controversial. The scientific study of fingerprints began in the 1880s with the work of Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin who applied evolutionary principles to the study of human variation and inheritance. Galton's systematic examination of fingerprint patterns led to the discovery that the ridge patterns on human fingertips were unique to each individual and remained unchanged throughout life, providing a permanent and unalterable form of personal identification. Galton's research established the scientific foundation for fingerprint identification by demonstrating that the probability of two individuals sharing identical fingerprint patterns was so astronomically small as to be effectively impossible. His classification system for organizing and comparing fingerprint patterns made it practical to store and retrieve fingerprint records for large populations, creating the infrastructure necessary for widespread adoption of fingerprint identification. The practical application of fingerprint identification in criminal investigation was developed by Edward Henry, who created a classification and filing system that allowed fingerprint records to be organized and searched efficiently. The Henry system, which divided fingerprint patterns into distinct categories based on ridge characteristics and overall pattern types, made it possible for police departments to maintain comprehensive databases of criminal fingerprints. The first major success of fingerprint identification in British criminal investigation occurred in 1902, when a burglar named Harry Jackson was convicted, based on a fingerprint left on a freshly painted windowsill at the scene of a break-in. The fingerprint evidence was clear, unambiguous, and impossible to explain away through alternative theories, providing a type of proof that had never before been available to criminal investigators. The Jackson case demonstrated the revolutionary potential of fingerprint evidence by showing how a single, clearly identifiable mark could connect a suspect to a crime scene with absolute certainty. The fingerprint left on the windowsill became a form of signature that Jackson could not deny, disguise, or transfer to another person, eliminating the uncertainties that had previously plagued criminal identification. Public reaction to the Jackson conviction reflected both fascination and uneasiness with the implications of fingerprint identification. On one hand, the ability to identify criminals with scientific precision promised to make society safer by ensuring that repeat offenders could not escape justice through deception or false identity. On the other hand, the permanent and unalterable nature of fingerprint identification raised concerns about privacy and the potential for government surveillance. The success of fingerprint identification led to its rapid adoption by police forces throughout Britain and eventually around the world, creating international networks of criminal identification that made it increasingly difficult for lawbreakers to escape their past by simply changing locations. The standardization of fingerprint classification systems allowed different police departments to share information and coordinate investigations across jurisdictional boundaries. The cultural impact of fingerprint identification extended beyond law enforcement to influence broader Victorian understanding of individual identity, scientific authority, and the relationship between physical characteristics and personal responsibility. The idea that each person carried permanent and unique biological markers seemed to confirm Victorian beliefs about the scientific basis of individual difference and social classification. Fingerprint identification also contributed to the development of modern concepts of forensic evidence and scientific proof in legal proceedings. The objective, measurable nature of fingerprint comparison provided a model for other forms of physical evidence and helped establish standards for the admissibility and evaluation of scientific testimony in criminal trials. The philosophical implications of fingerprint identification were profound, as it suggested that individual identity was written in the body itself in ways that could be read and interpreted through scientific analysis. This biological understanding of identity had implications for Victorian ideas about inheritance, criminality, and the relationship between physical characteristics and moral character. The introduction of fingerprint identification also marked a significant step in the bureaucratization of law enforcement, as police departments developed specialized units, standardized procedures, and extensive record-keeping systems to support fingerprint operations. The technical requirements of fingerprint identification encouraged the professionalization of police work and the development of scientific approaches to criminal investigation. The legacy of Victorian fingerprint identification continues to influence modern law enforcement, though the techniques and technologies have evolved far beyond what Galton and Henry could have imagined. The principle that physical evidence can provide objective proof of individual identity remains central to forensic science, while the databases and classification systems they pioneered have expanded to include DNA profiles, facial recognition systems, and other biometric identification methods. The story of fingerprint identification illustrates the broader Victorian transformation of criminal investigation from an art based on intuition and experience into a science based on systematic observation, measurement, and analysis. This shift represented not just a change in police techniques, but a fundamental alteration in how society understood the nature of crime, identity, and justice. From the scientific precision of fingerprint identification, let us examine another crucial Victorian innovation in criminal investigation: the systematic documentation of criminal suspects through photography and detailed record-keeping. The development of mugshots and criminal records represented a revolutionary approach to law enforcement that transformed repeat offenders from anonymous figures who could disappear into the crowd into documented individuals whose criminal histories could follow them throughout their lives. Before the Victorian era, the identification of repeat offenders relied almost entirely on human memory and personal recognition, methods that were unreliable at best and completely ineffective when criminals moved to new locations or significantly altered their appearance. A clever lawbreaker could escape his criminal past simply by growing a beard, changing his clothes, or adopting a new name, making it virtually impossible for law enforcement to track patterns of criminal behavior or impose appropriate sentences based on previous convictions. The introduction of photography in the mid-19th century provided law enforcement with the first practical method for creating permanent visual records of criminal suspects that could be stored, organized, and consulted whenever questions of identity arose. The stark, standardized format of police photography, with its front-facing and profile views, was designed not to flatter or memorialize, but to capture identifying characteristics that could be recognized even years after the original arrest. Victorian mugshots represented a systematic attempt to reduce human individuality to standard, measurable, and comparable forms that could be processed by bureaucratic systems designed to track and control criminal populations. The rigid posing requirements, neutral backgrounds, and standardized lighting of police photography created a visual language that emphasized identification over personality, criminality over humanity. The development of police photography was closely connected to broader Victorian fascination with physiognomy and phrenology, pseudosciences that claim to identify criminal tendencies and moral character through analysis of facial features and skull shape. While these theories have been thoroughly discredited, they influenced early police photography by encouraging officers to pay particular attention to facial characteristics that were thought to reveal criminal nature. The systematic collection and organization of criminal photographs required the development of new bureaucratic systems and filing methods that could accommodate large numbers of images, while allowing rapid retrieval when specific individuals needed to be identified. Police departments experimented with various classification schemes based on physical characteristics, criminal specialties, and geographic regions of operation. Alongside photographic documentation, Victorian police forces began maintaining detailed written records of criminal suspects that included not only basic identifying information, but also descriptions of criminal methods, known associates, and patterns of behavior that could help investigators connect crimes to repeat offenders. These records represented the first systematic attempt to treat criminal investigation as an information processing activity that required careful documentation and analysis. The creation of criminal records reflected Victorian confidence in the power of systematic organization and scientific classification to solve social problems through the accumulation and analysis of detailed information. Police departments became centers of data collection and storage, accumulating vast archives of information about criminal activities and the individuals who engaged in them. The anthropometric system developed by Alphonse Bertillon provided a standardized method for recording precise physical measurements of criminal suspects, creating detailed records that could identify individuals even when photographs were unavailable or unclear. Bertillon's system required trained operators to measure skull dimensions, arm span, finger length, and other physical characteristics according to strict protocols that ensured consistency and accuracy. While Bertillon's system was eventually superseded by fingerprint identification, it represented an important step in the development of scientific approaches to criminal identification, and demonstrated the Victorian belief that human individuality could be reduced to measurable data that could be systematically organized and analyzed. The cultural implications of criminal photography and record-keeping were significant and controversial, as these practices raised fundamental questions about privacy, social control, and the proper relationship between individuals and state authority. The creation of permanent criminal records meant that past mistakes could follow individuals indefinitely, potentially preventing rehabilitation and reintegration into respectable society. The visual impact of criminal photography was particularly powerful, as mugshots created a new category of public imagery that associated specific facial types and expressions with criminal behavior. The wide circulation of criminal photographs in newspapers and police publications contributed to the development of popular stereotypes about criminal appearance and reinforced class and ethnic prejudices about who was likely to engage in illegal activities. The bureaucratization of criminal identification also contributed to the professionalization of police work by creating specialized roles for photographers, records clerks, and identification experts who possessed technical skills that distinguished them from ordinary patrol officers. The management of criminal information became a crucial police function that required ongoing training and systematic procedures. The international exchange of criminal photographs and records created new possibilities for tracking criminals across national boundaries and coordinating law enforcement activities between different jurisdictions. The standardization of identification procedures facilitated cooperation between police forces and contributed to the development of international law enforcement networks. The Victorian innovations in criminal documentation established many of the principles and practices that continue to characterize modern law enforcement information systems. The emphasis on standardized procedures, systematic organization, and long-term storage of criminal information remains central to contemporary police work, though the technologies and scale of these operations have expanded dramatically. The development of criminal photography and record-keeping also contributed to broader changes in how society understood individual identity, social responsibility, and the relationship between past behavior and present circumstances. The permanent nature of criminal records reinforced Victorian beliefs about moral character, while creating new challenges for concepts of forgiveness, redemption, and second chances. The legacy of Victorian criminal documentation continues to influence contemporary debates about privacy, surveillance, and the appropriate balance between public safety and individual rights. The techniques pioneered by Victorian police forces have evolved into sophisticated databases and information-sharing systems that raise many of the same fundamental questions about social control and personal freedom that concerned critics of the original mugshot and criminal record systems. As we move from the systematic documentation of criminals to the scientific detection of their methods, let us explore one of the most significant advances in Victorian forensic science, the development of reliable techniques for detecting poisons in human remains. This innovation was particularly crucial because poisoning represented one of the most feared and difficult-to-detect forms of murder in Victorian society, often allowing calculating killers to disguise their crimes as natural deaths or accidents. Poison held a special terror for Victorian society because it violated fundamental assumptions about domestic safety and social trust that underpinned middle-class life. Unlike other forms of violence that occurred in public spaces or involved obvious weapons, poisoning typically took place in private homes and involved the corruption of basic necessities, such as food, drink, or medicine, that were supposed to provide comfort and healing rather than death. The domestic nature of most poisoning cases also meant that the perpetrators were usually family members, servants, or other individuals who had intimate access to their victims' daily routines and consumption habits. The idea that those who were supposed to provide care and protection might instead be secretly administering fatal substances challenged Victorian ideals about family life, gender roles, and social hierarchy. Arsenic became known as the inheritance powder because of its frequent use by impatient heirs who wished to accelerate their access to family wealth, but it was also employed by wives seeking to escape unhappy marriages, servants hoping to rob their employers, and various other domestic murderers who saw poison as a relatively safe and undetectable method for eliminating inconvenient individuals. The challenge facing Victorian investigators was that poison victims often displayed symptoms that could easily be attributed to natural illnesses, particularly the digestive ailments and mysterious fevers that were common in an era of poor sanitation and limited medical understanding. Without reliable methods for detecting toxic substances in the body, even the most suspicious circumstances rarely provided sufficient evidence for criminal prosecution. The scientific breakthrough that revolutionized poison detection came with the development of the Marsh test in 1836, a chemical procedure that could reliably identify minute quantities of arsenic in bodily tissues, fluids, or suspected substances. James Marsh's technique involved treating samples with zinc and acid to produce arsine gas, which could then be detected through distinctive reactions that provided clear, observable evidence of arsenic presence. The Marsh test was remarkable not only for its sensitivity and accuracy, but also for its dramatic visual impact when demonstrated in courtrooms. The chemical reactions produced distinctive colors and precipitates that could be easily observed by juries, creating powerful physical evidence that was much more convincing than the abstract arguments that had previously characterized poisoning trials. The success of the Marsh test encouraged the development of similar procedures for detecting other common poisons, including strychnine, cyanide, and various plant-based toxic substances that were used by creative murderers, hoping to avoid the increasingly well-known arsenic detection methods. Each new test expanded the range of poisoning cases that could be investigated scientifically and reduced the opportunities for clever criminals to escape detection. The impact of reliable poison detection on Victorian criminal investigation was immediate and dramatic. Cases that had previously been impossible to prove became opportunities for clear scientific demonstration of criminal activity, while the knowledge that poisoning attempts could be detected served as a deterrent to potential murderers who had previously considered toxic substances to be perfect weapons. The development of forensic toxicology also required changes in legal procedures and standards of evidence, as courts had to learn how to evaluate and present complex scientific testimony to juries who possessed no specialized knowledge of chemistry or medicine. Expert witnesses became crucial figures in poisoning trials, with their credibility and ability to explain technical concepts often determining the outcomes of criminal cases. However, the early years of forensic toxicology were not without problems and controversies. The chemical tests were complex procedures that required skilled practitioners and careful attention to detail, creating opportunities for errors that could lead to false accusations or allow guilty parties to escape conviction. Defense attorneys quickly learned to challenge the competence of forensic chemists and the reliability of their procedures. The public fascination with poison detection contributed to widespread anxiety about domestic security and the safety of everyday consumption. Newspaper coverage of poisoning trials often included detailed descriptions of symptoms and detection methods, creating both educational awareness and neurotic fear about the possibility of being secretly poisoned by family members, servants, or business associates. The chemical analysis of suspected poisons also revealed the extent to which toxic substances were readily available in Victorian society for legitimate purposes. Arsenic was commonly used in wallpaper dyes, pesticides, and various industrial processes, while strychnine served as a rat poison and medicinal stimulant. The overlap between legitimate and criminal uses of these substances created ongoing challenges for regulation and prevention. The success of Victorian toxicology encouraged the development of more sophisticated analytical techniques and contributed to the broader emergence of forensic science as a distinct discipline that combined chemical knowledge with legal application. The principles and methods developed during this period established the foundation for modern forensic toxicology and demonstrated the potential for scientific analysis to provide objective evidence in criminal investigations. The cultural legacy of Victorian poison detection extended beyond law enforcement to influence literature, popular culture, and social attitudes toward domestic relationships and personal security. The knowledge that science could reveal hidden crimes contributed to Victorian confidence in rational investigation, while also reinforcing anxieties about the potential for deception and betrayal in intimate relationships. The development of reliable poison detection also had important implications for medical practice and public health, as physicians became more aware of the symptoms of toxic exposure and better equipped to diagnose and treat poisoning cases. The intersection of criminal investigation and medical knowledge created opportunities for advances in both fields that benefited society more broadly. From the chemical detection of poisons, let us turn our attention to another crucial Victorian innovation in criminal investigation: the systematic preservation and analysis of crime scenes as sources of physical evidence that could provide crucial information about criminal activities and the individuals who committed them. This development represented a fundamental shift from treating crime scenes as chaotic aftermath to viewing them as carefully preserved laboratories that could yield scientific insights. Throughout most of history, the locations where crimes occurred were typically disturbed immediately after discovery. As curious crowds gathered to examine the scene, family members attempted to restore order, and authorities removed bodies and evidence without systematic documentation. This casual approach to crime scene management meant that crucial information was often lost or contaminated before investigators could analyze it properly. The Victorian Revolution in crime scene investigation began with the recognition that the physical environment of criminal activity contained valuable information that could be preserved, documented, and analyzed to provide insights into what had occurred and who might have been responsible. This insight required investigators to treat crime scenes as scientific subjects rather than merely locations where arrests needed to be made. The development of crime scene photography provided the first practical method for creating permanent records of physical evidence in its original context, allowing investigators to study and analyze scenes long after the original locations had been cleaned up or altered. Early police photographers developed specialized techniques for documenting evidence, including the use of artificial lighting, multiple angles, and detailed close-up shots of specific items or areas. The systematic collection of physical evidence from crime scenes required the development of new procedures and equipment for preserving materials that might provide crucial information about criminal activities. Victorian investigators began collecting samples of soil, fabric fibers, hair, bloodstains, and other materials that could be analyzed in laboratories or compared with evidence from suspects or other crime scenes. The preservation of crime scenes also required changes in police procedures and training, as officers had to learn to secure locations against contamination, while documenting the positions of objects, bodies, and other evidence before anything was disturbed. This systematic approach to evidence collection represented a significant departure from traditional law enforcement practices that emphasized rapid response and immediate action. The scientific analysis of crime scene evidence contributed to the development of new forensic techniques and areas of expertise that expanded the range of information that could be extracted from physical materials. The examination of bloodstain patterns, for example, could provide insights into the positions and movements of victims and attackers during violent crimes, while the analysis of tool marks and other trace evidence could connect suspects to specific criminal activities. One of the most significant applications of Victorian crime scene investigation was in cases involving the notorious Jack the Ripper murders in London's Whitechapel district during the late 1880s. While the killer was never caught, the police efforts to document and analyze the crime scenes represented some of the most systematic attempts at forensic investigation that had been undertaken up to that time. The Ripper investigations involved detailed photography of crime scenes and victims, careful documentation of wound patterns and injury locations, collection of potential evidence from the surrounding areas, and attempts to correlate physical evidence with witness testimony and suspect descriptions. While these efforts ultimately failed to identify the killer, they demonstrated the potential value of scientific crime scene analysis. The challenges faced during the Ripper investigations also highlighted the limitations of Victorian forensic techniques and the difficulties of maintaining crime scene integrity in urban environments, where curious crowds and sensationalist press coverage made systematic investigation extremely difficult. The balance between public interest and investigative necessity became a recurring theme in high-profile criminal cases. The development of crime scene investigation contributed to broader changes in how Victorian society understood the nature of criminal activity and the relationship between physical evidence and legal proof. The idea that crimes left traces that could be scientifically analyzed and interpreted provided new forms of objective evidence that could supplement or replace the subjective testimony that had previously dominated criminal trials. The systematic documentation of crime scenes also created new opportunities for comparing different criminal cases and identifying patterns of behavior that might connect apparently unrelated crimes to the same perpetrator. This comparative approach to criminal investigation represented an early form of what would later develop into criminal profiling and behavioral analysis. The cultural impact of Victorian crime scene investigation extended beyond law enforcement to influence popular understanding of criminal detection and scientific investigation. The detailed documentation and analysis of crime scenes contributed to public fascination with forensic science and reinforced Victorian confidence in the ability of rational investigation to solve complex problems. The techniques and principles developed during the Victorian period established the foundation for modern crime scene investigation and forensic science. The emphasis on systematic documentation, careful preservation of evidence, and scientific analysis of physical materials remain central to contemporary criminal investigation, though the technologies and methods have evolved dramatically. The legacy of Victorian crime scene investigation also includes important lessons about the challenges of balancing scientific rigor with practical law enforcement needs, maintaining evidence integrity while responding to public and political pressures, and translating complex forensic findings into forms that can be understood and evaluated by legal systems and ordinary citizens. The transformation of crime scenes from chaotic aftermath into systematic sources of scientific evidence represented one of the most significant advances in Victorian criminal investigation and established precedents that continue to influence how modern societies approach the investigation of criminal activities. and the pursuit of justice through rational inquiry and empirical analysis. From the scientific analysis of physical evidence, let us explore the Victorian fascination with understanding the criminal mind itself, through the development of early criminal profiling techniques that attempted to predict and identify criminal behavior through the systematic analysis of personality traits, physical characteristics, and behavioral patterns. This emerging field represented the intersection of Victorian confidence in scientific classification with deep anxieties about the nature of criminality and social disorder. The Victorian era's approach to criminal profiling was heavily influenced by pseudo-scientific theories that claimed to identify criminal tendencies through the analysis of physical characteristics, particularly facial features and skull shape. Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist whose theories gained widespread acceptance in Victorian Britain, argued that criminals represented evolutionary throwbacks to earlier stages of human development that could be identified through distinctive physical characteristics. Lombroso's theory of the born criminal suggested that certain individuals were biologically predetermined to engage in criminal behavior and could be identified through systematic analysis of physical traits, such as skull shape, facial asymmetry, jaw size, and ear formation. According to this theory, criminal behavior was not a matter of choice or social circumstance, but an expression of inherited biological characteristics that marked certain individuals as inherently antisocial. These theories appealed to Victorian sensibilities because they provided apparently scientific explanations for criminal behavior that reinforced existing social hierarchies and prejudices, while offering the promise that crime could be prevented through early identification and intervention. The idea that criminals could be recognized through physical examination seemed to offer a solution to the problem of social disorder that plagued rapidly growing industrial cities. The practical application of criminal anthropology in Victorian law enforcement involved training police officers to recognize physical characteristics that supposedly indicated criminal tendencies, developing classification systems for organizing information about criminal types, and using physiological analysis to supplement traditional investigative techniques. Some police departments even experimented with systematic measurement and documentation of suspect physical characteristics. However, the focus on physical characteristics was supplemented by growing interest in psychological and behavioral approaches to understanding criminal activity. Victorian investigators began to recognize that different types of crimes seemed to attract different types of perpetrators, and that understanding these patterns could help in identifying suspects and predicting future criminal activity. The investigation of serial crimes, particularly in cases involving multiple victims with similar characteristics or circumstances, encouraged the development of behavioral analysis techniques that focused on criminal methods, victim selection, and patterns of activity that might reveal information about the perpetrator's personality, lifestyle, and motivations. The Jack the Ripper case became a laboratory for early criminal profiling techniques, as investigators and consulting experts attempted to develop psychological portraits of the unknown killer based on analysis of the crimes, victim selection, and behavioral patterns evident in the murders. While these early profiling attempts were largely unsuccessful, they established precedents for the systematic analysis of criminal behavior. Victorian criminal profiling was also influenced by broader social anxieties about urban life, immigration, and social change that shaped how different types of criminal behavior were understood and categorized. The tendency to associate certain types of crimes with specific ethnic groups, social classes, or geographic regions reflected Victorian prejudices as much as objective analysis of criminal patterns. The development of criminal profiling techniques was closely connected to the emergence of criminal psychology, as a distinct field of study that attempted to understand the motivations and mental processes that led individuals to engage in illegal activities. This psychological approach represented a significant departure from traditional explanations of crime that emphasized moral failing or supernatural influence. Victorian criminal profiling also incorporated elements of social analysis that recognized the relationship between environmental conditions and criminal behavior. Though these insights were often overshadowed by biological and psychological theories that emphasized individual characteristics over social circumstances, the recognition that poverty, education, and family background influenced criminal behavior laid the groundwork for later developments in criminology. The practical limitations of Victorian criminal profiling became apparent in cases where physical and psychological analysis failed to identify suspects or led investigators to focus on inappropriate targets. The tendency to profile criminals based on stereotypes and prejudices, rather than objective evidence, created significant problems for law enforcement and contributed to the wrongful persecution of innocent individuals. Despite these limitations, Victorian criminal profiling established important precedents for the systematic analysis of criminal behavior and contributed to the development of investigative techniques that remain relevant to modern law enforcement. The emphasis on understanding criminal psychology, analyzing behavioral patterns, and connecting different crimes to common perpetrators continues to influence contemporary criminal investigation. The legacy of Victorian criminal profiling also includes important cautionary lessons about the dangers of allowing social prejudices and pseudo-scientific theories to influence criminal investigation. The tendency to profile suspects based on ethnic, class, or physical characteristics, rather than evidence-based analysis, created significant problems for justice and reinforced discriminatory practices that had lasting negative effects on law enforcement credibility. The evolution of criminal profiling from Victorian pseudoscience to modern behavioral analysis illustrates the broader development of forensic science and criminal investigation from intuitive art to systematic discipline based on empirical research and scientific methodology. This transformation continues to influence how modern societies approach the challenge of understanding and preventing criminal behavior. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration of Victorian crime-solving innovations, it becomes clear that the transformation of criminal investigation during the 19th century represented far more than a series of technical improvements in law enforcement. The Victorian era witnessed a fundamental revolution in how society understood crime, justice, and the relationship between scientific knowledge and social order that established the foundations for modern approaches to criminal investigation and forensic science. The Victorian confidence in rational inquiry and systematic methodology created an environment where innovative approaches to criminal investigation could flourish and gain acceptance, even when they challenged traditional assumptions about justice and evidence. The willingness to experiment with new techniques and embrace scientific approaches to law enforcement reflected broader Victorian beliefs about progress, improvement, and the power of human knowledge to solve complex social problems. The development of professional detective work, forensic autopsy, fingerprint identification, criminal photography, toxicology, crime scene investigation, and criminal profiling during the Victorian period created an integrated system of criminal investigation that was far more sophisticated and effective than anything that had previously existed. These innovations worked together to transform law enforcement from a reactive force that responded to crimes after they occurred into a proactive institution that could prevent crime, identify criminals, and provide compelling evidence for prosecution. The cultural impact of Victorian crime-solving innovations extended far beyond law enforcement itself, to influence literature, journalism, popular culture, and public understanding of justice and social order. The figure of the detective became a cultural hero who embodied Victorian ideals about rationality, progress, and the triumph of knowledge over ignorance, while the scientific analysis of criminal behavior provided new ways of thinking about individual responsibility and social causation. However, the Victorian transformation of criminal investigation also revealed the potential dangers of applying scientific methods to social problems without adequate attention to issues of bias, discrimination, and social justice. The tendency to use forensic techniques to reinforce existing prejudices and social hierarchies created lasting problems for law enforcement credibility and highlighted the importance of maintaining ethical standards in the application of scientific knowledge to criminal justice. The international influence of Victorian crime-solving innovations spread rapidly throughout Europe and beyond, creating global networks of information sharing and cooperation that transformed criminal investigation from a local activity into an international enterprise. The standardization of techniques and procedures facilitated collaboration between different police forces and contributed to the development of modern international law enforcement organizations. The legacy of Victorian criminal investigation continues to influence contemporary approaches to forensic science and law enforcement, though the techniques and technologies have evolved dramatically beyond what 19th century investigators could have imagined. The fundamental principles of systematic observation, scientific analysis, and evidence-based investigation that were established during the Victorian period remain central to modern criminal justice systems. The story of Victorian crime-solving also provides important insights into the relationship between technological innovation and social change, demonstrating how advances in scientific knowledge and investigative techniques can both reflect and shape broader cultural attitudes about justice, authority, and social order. The Victorian transformation of criminal investigation illustrates the complex ways that scientific progress intersects with social values and political interests. As our journey through Victorian crime-solving draws to a close, We can see how these innovations created the foundation for contemporary approaches to criminal investigation, while also raising enduring questions about the proper balance between scientific efficiency and individual rights, between social protection and personal privacy, between objective analysis and subjective judgment that continue to influence debates about criminal justice and forensic science today. The Victorian era's contribution to criminal investigation represents one of the most significant advances in the history of law enforcement, establishing principles and practices that transformed the pursuit of justice from an art based on intuition and tradition into a science based on systematic observation, rigorous analysis, and empirical evidence. This transformation continues to influence how modern societies approach the challenge of maintaining order and protecting individual rights in complex urban environments. From the gaslit streets of Victorian London and the emergence of scientific crime-solving, let our thoughts drift backward through time to the shadowed chambers and candlelit halls, where medieval warrior monks gathered to welcome new members into their sacred brotherhood. The initiation ceremonies of the Knights Templar represent one of history's most fascinating examples of ritual transformation, where young men crossed the threshold from ordinary knights into members of a religious military order that would shape the course of medieval history. The very secrecy that surrounded these ceremonies has made them subjects of speculation and legend for more than 7 centuries, with whispers of forbidden rites, heretical practices, and mystical knowledge that supposedly set the Templars apart from ordinary religious and military institutions. Yet beneath the layers of mystery and conspiracy theory lie the genuine historical practices of a remarkable organization that combined monastic spirituality with military discipline in ways that challenged conventional medieval categories. For a young man hoping to join the Knights Templar, the journey toward initiation began long before the actual ceremony, often starting with family connections, personal recommendation, or demonstration of exceptional skill in warfare or devotion that brought him to the attention of Templar recruiters. The order was selective in its membership, seeking men who could contribute not only military prowess, but also administrative ability, financial resources, and unwavering commitment to the cause of defending Christian territories in the Holy Land. The preliminary examination of potential initiates was thorough and demanding, designed to ensure that candidates possessed both the practical qualifications and spiritual dedication necessary for life within the order. Questions about debt, marriage, feudal obligations, and personal commitments served to identify men who could make the complete break with secular life that Templar membership required. The initiation ceremony itself was typically conducted at night, in the dim privacy of a chapel where flickering candlelight created an atmosphere of solemnity and mystery that emphasized the sacred nature of the transformation about to occur. The choice of nighttime for these ceremonies served both practical and symbolic purposes, providing secrecy from curious outsiders, while creating an environment that separated the ritual from ordinary daytime activities. The chapel setting reinforced the religious dimension of Templar identity, reminding participants that despite their military function, they were fundamentally monks who had dedicated their lives to God's service. The sacred architecture, religious artwork, and consecrated space provided a physical environment that supported the spiritual transformation that the ceremony was designed to accomplish. The candidate was brought before the assembled brothers in a state of ritual vulnerability, often having been questioned privately, and required to demonstrate his sincere desire to join the order through repeated confirmations of his commitment. This process of repeated consent was designed to ensure that the initiation represented a free choice rather than coercion or momentary enthusiasm that might later be regretted. The taking of the threefold vow represented the heart of the initiation ceremony, as the candidate pledged himself to poverty, chastity, and obedience, in words that would bind him for life to a radically different way of existence. Each vow represented not just a practical commitment, but a theological statement about the proper relationship between human desires and divine will. The vow of poverty required the initiate to surrender all personal possessions to the order, transforming him from an individual property owner into a member of a community that held all things in common. This radical economic transformation reflected monastic ideals about the spiritual dangers of material attachment, while also serving the practical purpose of concentrating resources under centralized control. Chastity demanded the renunciation of marriage and family life, commitments that medieval society viewed as fundamental to male identity and social responsibility. By taking this vow, the Templar initiate declared his willingness to sacrifice the normal human relationships that provided emotional support and social continuity in favor of an exclusive commitment to his religious brothers and spiritual mission. Obedience represented, perhaps the most challenging aspect of Templar life, requiring absolute submission to the authority of superiors and the rule of the order. This vow transformed independent knights, accustomed to personal autonomy, into disciplined members of a hierarchical organization where individual will was subordinated to collective purpose and divine command. The investiture with the white mantle marked the visible transformation of the initiate from secular knight to Templar brother, as the distinctive garment symbolized both purity of purpose and membership in an elite brotherhood that transcended national and ethnic boundaries. The white color carried specific theological significance, representing the purification of the soul and dedication to spiritual perfection that monastic life was designed to achieve. The red cross that adorned the Templar mantle served as a constant reminder of the order's military mission and the willingness of its members to shed their blood in defense of Christian territories and pilgrims. This symbol connected each individual Templar to the broader historical narrative of crusading warfare, while also identifying him as a participant in the cosmic struggle between good and evil that medieval Christianity viewed as the fundamental reality of human existence. The whispered prayers and secret formulas that accompanied the initiation ceremony created an atmosphere of exclusive knowledge